Hello, everyone. Holy shit, I think my mic is super loud. Let me turn that down. All right, hopefully that's a little bit more manageable. Oh, yeah, my mic was super loud. I know because I left the audio on. God damn it, I always do this. All right, turn my mic down. Yeah, that's true. Two mistakes makes a right on this show. But anyway, thanks for joining us, guys. Three Wonks, another episode, policy-focused show. You guys should know the deal by now, guys. Okay, it's all pretty self-explanatory. We're talking about policy on this show. We've got an interesting and exciting announcement. Let's just say we have officially launched the Policy Wonk Bracket 2024. Let me go to the React screen so you guys can see it in all of its glory. Look at this behemoth, okay? Three Wonks Policy Tournament. Marcel Juvie, thanks for following on Twitch of all places. Don't get many Twitch viewers. We're more of a YouTube stream, but we have a Twitch public option for people to use if they want. So this is our bracket. These are the matchups that we've come up with. Matchups approved by the three hosts, which means that I did it, and then these guys basically had no feedback. Typical for the Three Wonks show. And so I did this, and then these next rounds will get interesting. We kind of organized this into top 4 seeds, so that the corners of the brackets are the policies we think are most likely to sort of make it to the semifinal. And you can see we've got overarching healthcare as probably one of our number 1 seeds here. We've got, either the Swiss model or the Canadian system probably making it to the semifinals. They're going at it in the first round. Then we've got mandatory union recognition versus established sectoral bargaining. Let's be honest, I think sectoral bargaining is a semifinalist. Prove me wrong by voting in the tournament bracket. On the right side of the bracket, LVT, at least a semifinalist if you ask me. There's probably nothing that's going to stop LVT. There's the slightest outside chance that LVT goes down to Japanese model mixed use zoning. Frankly, I'll probably end up voting for mixed use zoning over LVT. That's probably the more impactful policy on housing affordability in America today, but don't tell liberals that on Twitter. And then our next number 1 seed, we have some sort of carbon tax and or some sort of investment in green energy technology. Those are sort of our top 4 seeds, and then we've filtered all these policies into, let's say, like roughly thematic buckets. Because we came up with these policies independently, they weren't entirely, it's not easy to fit all of them into totally logical, distinct buckets, but we have sort of the public health section of the bracket in the top left here, and then we go down to a bunch of labor policies in the bottom right of the bracket. And then over here we've got housing and sort of maybe like general welfare sort of, needs and wants types policies that you can come up with. And then up top we have sort of environmental trade policies, again, roughly speaking. So there are going to be some interesting matchups. People have already commented. One of the more interesting matchups that we have here is SDL's Unhinged, nationalize Ozempic and make it free, versus ending qualified immunity for law enforcement. An interesting matchup. I think currently in the voting, ending qualified immunity is by far and away winning this matchup. Extremely interesting. But anyway, guys, go on our Twitter. The link is in the description of this stream right now. It'll be in the description of any future video that we make on this topic. Go and vote. Voting is going to be 1 week long, and then it's going to be every other week when we release new voting. The last round of the election, or the last round of this tournament, will be the weekend before the November presidential election. It all lines up pretty perfectly every other week to have a new round. And of course, from my perspective, this tournament gets twice as easy to manage as we go on because we have half as many matchups each round. I had to manually put in 22 policies because the stupid automatic tweet fucking thing that I use only allows you to do 10 policies sort of tweeted out at once. And so next round I'll only have 6 that I'll have to do. And then the next round, it'll be less than 10. So we've got very little time until we really start to whittle these down. Who will win? I have several different metrics that I'll be tracking. Of course, we're going to be tracking obviously like who the finale is. If we have an opportunity for an interesting bronze medal match between the losers in the semifinal, we will do that. It'll depend on the matchup, but I don't know. That could be fun to determine a bronze medalist. We'll have a gold, silver, bronze medalist. I will also be tracking the records of policies. So as, socialist, liberal, social democratic policies clash with each other, sometimes we're going to have social democrat versus social democrat policies, just depending on who wins in the previous rounds. But as we have different ideological matchup rounds, I'll be tracking the win-loss records, and I will be tracking the total popular vote of each ideology's policies, right? So we could have some perplexing outcomes. We could come to the end and we could have a social democratic policy win the finale, but also maybe lose the popular vote because of how a double, one-on-one versus bracket ends up going. You could have more liberal policies make it deeper into the bracket, thus winning the popular vote, but losing in the finale. Could be very, very interesting. And of course, you could end up having a scenario where I guess you might have you might dominate the first round, but you might do terribly in the subsequent round. So you might win in the overall win-loss record, but again, you might end up losing the popular vote or the finale. Of course, you might not make it to the finale even if you do well in the first round. It's all going to be very interesting stuff if you ask me. We've already got people battling it out on Twitter. Got some notable retweets. SDL, Micah, myself, obviously. Best Trousers has thrown his ring in by saying we should have had unemployment insurance reform in the bracket. Yeah, we got rid of it. I had a Gint system. I had boosted unemployment for union workers on strike, and it just didn't make... I didn't look. Neither of our unemployment systems. Oh, sorry. Hold on. You guys speak real quick.
Testing.
There we go. Luckily, you guys haven't been talking this whole time. They can hear you now. But no,
Okay, just to repeat the jabs we had. I had unemployment in there. Best Trousers proposal is around experience ratings, which is sort of a tax that's placed on companies, which goes up as they fire more people. It's meant to discourage them from doing layoffs, but in practice, it just seems to discourage firing. There's a whole bunch of weird incentives around it. So I much prefer just do a nice, simple, federally funded thing.
I agree. Look, I agree, SDL. Unfortunately, it didn't make the final cut because not everyone is Best Trousers on Twitter, okay? Not everyone loves unemployment insurance as much as he does.
I had full expensing in there. I just want to say that I didn't put it in my
didn't put it in his final policies.
And I kept true to my promises to the people, okay? I put in the weird audience topic of socialized dog breeding. That's right. I sent a policy to the pit.
He did. We have, so in the first round, we have, where is it? We've got socialized dog breeding versus establishing a national investment bank. Frankly, I think at this point in the tournament, I think National Investment Bank has 95% of the vote in this matchup personally. So I think it's probably going to end up being sovereign wealth fund funded by resource rent taxation versus a national investment bank. A very interesting matchup, if you ask me, in the next round of 32. Micah?
It is extremely dumb, unfair, and stupid that my best two policies are about to go up against each other. Mixed-use zoning versus land value tax. Both of these are literally finalist policies, and you've placed them to one of them's going to get taken out.
Did you raise any objections, Micah?
Just to be clear, I gave all the hosts the ability to challenge the ordering of the bracket. The issue with these four policies specifically, because I think there's a world where 1% GDP investment in public housing goes pretty far in the bracket, but again, thematically, all the housing policies should probably be linked together, and so that's why we're going to probably end up having that serious, that's a pretty crazy matchup in the next round, and I'm not sure who will end up winning. Again, frankly, I would vote for universal mixed-use zoning over a land value tax if I had the choice in terms of, the overall welfare benefits of society. Although some might disagree, Lars would probably have some strong words for me in that regard. But some of these policies, look, for instance, right, we go up into the top right, we've had to put up two policies that could be semifinalists in and of themselves. Swiss model healthcare versus single payer. Whoever wins that matchup is almost certainly making it at least to the semifinals, right? And so it's whoever wins that matchup is going to make it to the semifinals. And to be fair, we cannot sleep on national health system, the British model, which is basically the other analog to our overall sort of healthcare models. That could make it to the semifinals as well. I could see a scenario where we have NHS versus like the Swiss model, and then people like me say, I'd prefer the NHS over the Swiss model. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't, but I could see that happening.
Can I just review some of the atom bomb versus coughing baby matchups?
Yeah, sure.
So one we have is liberal draft. End the electoral college and replace it with a popular vote. Okay, atom bomb versus pay people $100 to vote. This is just not a fair matchup, right? Like one would fundamentally restructure the country to be more democratic, and the other is like marginal. I love this one, and of course there's the dog breeding one you mentioned.
Yeah, some of these matchups are crazy. Look at we have this one, ban right to work versus making DC and Puerto Rico states. That's an insane matchup. We just kind of had to do it that way because what else? We had to match some of these policies in oblong ways, right? So that's a crazy one. We've got socialized news media consumption versus banning gerrymandering, an interesting democratic matchup. If you look, the point, guys, all these matchups are really fascinating. Okay, really think about which one of these policies you'd prioritize. Like one that I had a problem with was actually this very next one, active labor market policies versus points-based immigration. I don't know. Like if I had to choose one of them, that's a really tough one for me. I'm not sure.
That's
like
so easy. It's so
oh my
easy.
God.
Mike is just going to point out that there's these huge income benefits for letting immigrants into the country, right? And that like the social utility for the world is higher, right?
Yeah, of course.
But maybe if we do active labor market policies, then fewer Rust Belt voters will become Republicans, and then they'll vote for the immigration policies anyway. Got to think about the second order effects, Micah.
We can't think of the second order event. The effects that this policy has on the implementation probabilities of other policies. That's not fair. But clearly, I think
Micah be like, it's ceteris paribus or bust. Okay, ridiculous.
Absolutely. Listen, if you take out your utility calculator, like
I'm sorry, let me pull it out real quick.
Expanding immigration is one of the best policies you could possibly do. Now, the implication of points-based immigration, I think I wrote it down there, is that it's going to be like Australia. So it's very permissive. Technically, you can have a points-based immigration system that is very restrictive, which is what the Tories promised in the UK but never did.
Yep. Now, I think that is one of the misleading things you'll hear American conservatives say, we should do points-based immigration just like the Australians, right? And it's like, I don't think your points-based system would be just like the Australians if we implemented such a system. The advantage, though, I agree, of a points-based system is that it's fairly objective. It allows people to get visas in a much quicker way because you either have the amount of points you need or you don't. It would be better than our current immigration system. But look, our active labor market policies could use some reform too, Micah. I don't know. What do we do? It's a tough one. But anyway, I think on the utilitarian calculus,
one more. It's annoying to me. Okay. Atomic bomb versus coughing baby. So first, the coughing baby is my policy. I put in mandatory union recognition. Raise the payroll tax by 1% for every month that a union, which won its election, goes unrecognized. So that's like a very simple policy. It's like, oh, they got to get a contract, some shit like that. That's like a marginal positive thing, right? And then the one opposing it is the one that Econoboy got, which is sectoral bargaining, which is like a monumental shift that will double U.S. labor capacity like overnight.
Look, sectoral bargaining had to eat something for lunch in this first round, and mandatory union recognition was going to be one of them. I mean, look at the other policies. I could have put it against active labor market policies. I could have put it against, I guess, right of first refusal. I mean, it just seemed like union policy versus union policy.
Look, it makes sense. I'm just mad that you got the sectoral bargaining. Okay, I'm seething. I'm coping. I'm pissing.
Yeah,
I'm whining.
Yeah. I drafted for it. Look, we'll see. You got universal child care. I think was the policy that you got in the draft as a result. And so I think that's what. Let me see. What's that going against on the other side of the bracket? So you drafted universal child care, and how did that end up? Oh wait, did you not even include that in your policies?
I think I took it out.
Oh my God! What?
It feels like it's too close to. I don't know. Look, I'm leading with my heart. Okay, I'm not.
STL's strategy. Yeah, STL's fucking election strategy in this tournament has been bizarre and weird. But look, Trump won in 2016. STL could win in this bracket, bizarrely enough. He's taking socialized dog breeding right to the top. All right. The point is, guys, voting will be open for a week. Go to our Twitter, link in the description of this stream right now. Go and vote. Make your voice heard, and obviously contribute to what is hopefully a, decently robust policy discussion. The point that we do this is obviously that it's fun. And also in the lead up to the 2024 election, let's try to talk a little bit more about policy, ideally. Micah?
Well, I just looked through the polls, and right now, STL, I'm sorry to say that you're only leading in 5 of them right now. So you might get... I think STL went very wonky in an attempt to not have overlap with you, Econoboy. So unfortunately...
Look, we have to respect the experimental approach of STL. He says, look, I'm taking risks in order to get high rewards, and, but it's also high risk, right? So we have to respect that approach from STL. Novel strategies sometimes produce extraordinary novel results. We'll see. But and to be fair, look, I have the experience benefit. I've run 2 of these tournaments on my own Twitter before. By the way, misinformation call out for myself last show. I said LVT never won the gold. LVT actually did win the gold last tournament. Okay, they were in the finals. I believe it was like a huge investment in green energy technologies versus LVT, and LVT won the gold in a policy tournament with twice as many policies as we have now. Okay, an entire extra round of voting. They still ended up winning the gold in 2023. So we'll see what ends up winning.
Is it because I have an extra policy that I have 2 of my own policies going against each other?
That's right.
Ooh, maybe it wasn't benefit after all. Maybe you should have guessed tails, buddy.
It's like a primary system. Yeah,
it just gets rid of one of the weaker one of the 2.
The strongest policy will end up going against, I guess, ending qualified immunity for law enforcement. So that'll be the next policy matchup.
Against another one of mine? Oh, come on.
Well, look, we're dominating the shit out of STL, so a lot of our policies are going to go against each other in the next round. So that's just the natural consequence of STL kind of having a tough time with this.
Let me read something from chat. Esol says STL needs to withdraw. He needs to be replaced by a better representative of socialist thought, someone who can actually campaign. They're calling me Sleepy Joe, okay?
So you need to withdraw, okay, and endorse the viable liberal candidate fighting for criminal justice reform.
Oh my god.
Strategic. Look, in the next round, I expect STL's followers to strategically align themselves with social democracy. Okay, obviously, the socialists need to support the social democracy. We cannot afford any boycotts in this election. Okay, there's too many consequences on the line by sitting out this election. You need to go out and vote social democracy in the round of 32. Any final words on this tournament before we move on to talking about the DNC?
I would be interested, just as like a meta note, I would be interested. It would work best if we had 4 people, like some 4th person in the tournament, to have like policy areas where one would win in the first 2 rounds. Like you'd have 4, then 2, then 1, and then you'd have more of these different overlaps, like immigration versus active labor market policies. So you don't have to whip out your utility calculator so early. Like you can just stay on policy analysis a little bit. But no, I think it's really interesting, actually.
Look, we've had a long-standing recommendation to have a conservative 4th wonk host of the 3 wonks. We can't get rid of the 3 wonk name. We could just have 4 hosts on a show called 3 wonks. That'd be funny to me. The problem, though, for people recommending that, they never come with suggestions, right? It's like, oh, who's the wonky conservative, right? It's like, oh, what are we gonna have Dave Rubin on the show? Even if he was interested, he's a total dumbass, right? So like, who are like the smart wonky conservatives out there? Micah recommends King of the Coast, but I don't know that he's more than just a Twitter account. Like, I don't think he does interviews and things like that. So
he's not conservative too. Frankly, he's just a liberal as well. I think it kind of ruins the point of the show, because the entire point of the show is that we're like center to left.
That's true.
Like, in America, we're all left of the center, so it kind of makes a lot of sense.
Well, this is why we need an ML host, right? So that we can be centered to real left, right? Like, because
that's
I'm
true.
The fake left.
The original conception of the show was to have Unlearning Economics as another socialist host, because he's a worker democracy socialist, whereas STL is basically a state socialist, with sovereign wealth funds and state enterprise and things like this. At least that's like the majority focus. But unfortunately, Yui was too good for this show, unfortunately.
Right.
So he did not
They
accept.
turned up their nose. They snooted upon us. But you, the viewers of the show, you are the real proletariat. You are
too
the
busy
workers
eating
of the
fish and
world.
chips over in the UK to contribute to our policy analysis here on this show. Anyway, but anyway, guys, this is the tournament. Go on to Twitter, link in the description, vote, and yeah, it should be fun. This will go for the next, I guess, about 8 weeks or so, and it should be a fun time. So get out there and vote, people. All right. Next up, Micah, you went to the DNC. How was that?
Yeah, I went to the DNC as a member of the platform committee, which I mentioned in our previous episode. And I gotta say, it was like no other experience I've ever had in my life. There were not very many protesters, at least from what I observed, but there was such a huge number of people, which were all very active in the party. I mean, you had over 10,000 people, which are I think the heart and soul of the party. I was standing in lines and just chatting with people and asking them, "Hey, what do you do?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm a mayor of this city, and I think you're a mayor too." You know, I remember one of the notable experiences I had was I was waiting in the security line, and I was talking to this lady, and I asked her where she's from. She said she's from California. So, of course, I say, I'm sorry to hear that because I'm from Texas. I got to give everybody a hard time when they're from California. And so I should talk California a little bit, but jokingly. And eventually I find out that she's on the city council of of Los Angeles, which I promptly informed her, I'm so sorry to hear about that. I know you're fixing it. Okay. I'm sure you'll fix it soon. But yeah, it was truly an incredible experience.
Yeah, no, I mean, the energy seemed pretty insane at the DNC. You know, after going to the DNC, Micah, do you feel like, are you more confident in our chances of winning this November?
I think there was so many opportunities for things to not go our way. And at each one of those opportunities, it went exactly the way I would want it to go. Obama delivered a perfect speech. Michelle Obama delivered a perfect speech. There was almost no slip-ups. The vice president delivered a phenomenal speech. I mean, I couldn't imagine a better contrast with Trump's, 2 hours of rambling at the RNC. There were not really large interruptions. One of the things that was supposed to be a disaster for us was the fact that Charlie Kirk and Byron Donalds, or whatever his name is, got into the DNC. They were let in, they were given credentials, and they were made fun of by everybody. And we got a ridiculous amount of content making an absolute clown of these guys. One of the most notable moments that happened was this young kid named Noah. He's like 12 years old. He's like a rising celebrity in Democratic Party spaces, debating the My Pillow guy and like low-key destroying him. Like Noah kind of killed him. And the My Pillow guy released that video, which is pretty phenomenal.
I saw that video. I also saw Matt Walsh undercover, clearly not Matt Walsh undercover, as not Matt Walsh at the DNC. That was pretty funny. And I guess the My Pillow guy appeared to be in a bit of a disguise as well. I'm not sure why there were more than one right-wing, people in disguise at the DNC. Like, you could just show up, like you said. I don't know what the point of the disguises were. Maybe they were, I don't know, afraid or something. I'm not sure what, you'd necessarily be afraid of. But anyway, well, I'm glad to hear that the DNC went well. Micah, somebody asked in the chat, I've been interested in this question myself. What are the odds that our votes actually matter this year in Texas?
So for the presidential race, it's unlikely that it would flip blue. The polls don't suggest that will flip blue. And last time, it was a 5.6 point gap between Biden and Trump. I imagine that it will be narrower this time because of demographic shifts. We have certain urban areas like Austin becoming bluer and increasing their population. That, along with some other trends, predicts that we'd continue growing bluer, which we've been doing for over, I believe, the past 20 years.
It's crazy to me. I think Texas is now closer than Ohio to being a swing state, like by far, by like 4 points or something. It's
true. The big issue that we have is that we don't have very high turnout. If we had, I'd say the kind of normal amount of turnout, we'd actually be a purple state. We'd be like a North Carolina at this point in time. But places like my county, Harris County, doesn't have very high turnout. So I expect that Colin Allred will be very close to Ted Cruz. Right now, he's trailing by just a point because there's a lot of people that don't like Ted Cruz, and Colin Allred is a very moderate candidate, which is probably going to be spending even more money than Ted Cruz is. Also, there's a ton of other down ballot races that matter a lot. There's Court of Appeals races, which are very close because they contain tons of different counties. So even if you live in a blue county in the state of Texas, it doesn't really mean that your Court of Appeals candidates are safe. Many times they're in peril. There's Supreme Court races, which matter a lot. And even in a place like Harris County, sometimes Republicans manage to eke out a victory because our voters come and they vote at the top of the ballot and they don't vote down ballot. We need to have that down ballot discipline. So your vote absolutely matters in Texas. And I have no doubt that by the end of this decade, you will see us having control of at least a portion of the state government and at least one statewide office.
Yeah, Texas, the Texas House of Representatives, so not the U.S. House of Representatives in Texas, the state House of Representatives, I think is only maybe plus 10 or 12 Republicans. It's actually a very closely divided chamber in our legislature. And so Micah's prediction is probably spot on. And yeah, in 2028, the next presidential election, I think that's when you might have substantially more chances. Every election that goes by, we have Gen Z voters replacing boomer voters and silent generation voters, obviously, as those generations pass away and new generations become more prime-aged voters. Millennials are becoming middle-aged, right? I'm about the youngest millennial that's possible, 27 years old. In 2028, I'll be 31 years old. And then, millennials will be between, I guess, 31 and like 45 years old. Those are pretty much some of your prime voting years for the most part. That's when you start to enter in your more like sticky voting years at the very least. And so, yeah, I think in 2028, 2032, if the Republican Party doesn't substantially change their ways and moderate to a significant degree, it is hard to see these trends not being favorable in aggregate to Republicans, or to Democrats, I should say. Although, yeah, to answer the chatter's question, I think in this specific election, I think Trump's probably going to win by at least 4 to 5 points. I think Ted Cruz, Mike is probably right that Ted Cruz probably underperforms Trump in Texas, if I had to guess, but he probably still ends up winning his seat. And that's probably what we'll end up seeing. Although, look, it's possible. 5 points, you could see that changing. There's a lot of space between now and the actual election in November. So you never know what could actually end up happening.
And here's what's important. Right now, if we don't win in Texas, the best we can hope for is a 50-50 split Senate if John Tester wins in Montana. Now, Montana is a much redder state than Texas is. So the idea that we would write off Texas, which is becoming bluer over time and has the demographics we need to win, while counting on Montana to deliver us the split Senate we need to control the Senate if Vice President Harris wins the presidency, is a little bit absurd to me. Yeah. We have the responsibility in our current context to do everything we possibly can to make sure there's a Democratic trifecta. And that means we have no choice but to work as hard as we possibly can in the state of Texas for victory.
Yeah, unfortunately, if Tester loses in Montana, literally nothing will get passed in a Harris administration. She'll have an extremely difficult time getting her cabinet appointed, and
unless a moderate Republican switches parties. That's pretty much the only path, and that's pretty unlikely.
And also, I would say, as well, what do you call it? If we're not going to be able to put any pressure on the Supreme Court if there's not a 50-50 Senate, because obviously if there's Republican-controlled Senate, then we end up with Democratic sort of appointed Supreme Court justices being uncomfortable from retiring, and we end up in a scenario where perhaps Republican appointed justices feel more comfortable retiring, or at the very least, if they die, then we're not going to be able to replace them in office, which is pretty unfortunate. Look, if Kamala wins, I think you start to see a lot of pressure on Sotomayor to retire because she's actually relatively old at this point. She's past 70 years old. And you might even see the same thing with Elena Kagan. I think Elena Kagan is in her late 60s. And so you might see a lot of pressure on both of those people to actually resign their seats strategically in a Kamala sort of presidency, Republican-controlled Senate, just to replace them with younger people. That's a very important thing. Obviously, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, very selfish choice, not retiring 10 years before she probably should have. And we end up with a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court down the line. The reporting I saw on that was that she was very insistent that she wanted sort of symbolically the first woman president to nominate her replacement. Obviously, where did that get us, right? It ended up getting, she could have retired all the way back in 2012. We ended up in a scenario where, it turns out, unfortunately, it was January 2015, I think, was when the Senate actually turned Republican. So she could have retired all the way up to that point. We could have replaced her, but unfortunately, 4 years later, she ends up dying in office, and now we have Amy Coney Barrett, who is she's not quite as right wing as Alito, but she's still right wing, right? And so that's a very unfortunate replacement. So anyway, all that stuff's on the line. Final thoughts on the DNC before we move to our actual wonk policy topics today, guys.
I mean, I will say I have to have the obligatory critiques. Some are, one, I wish they let a Palestinian speak. I think that's, what's the line? It's worse than a bad, I'm forgetting the exact quote, which is a banger. It's worse than a bad action. It's a mistake. I think it's actually a real mistake. Just if you read the person who was the front runner to speak as a Palestinian, Rua, her speech is like, I think the Democratic Party can be better than supporting Netanyahu and far right stuff in Israel. I encourage everyone to vote for Kamala Harris. It's like very strongly Democratic Party speech, and it's very much in line with the Democratic Party's coalition of like combining all these identities and trying to bring them together. So I was frustrated about that. I do know, and this one might be for Micah, some people pointed out that the opposition to torture and the death penalty were not in the platform. Do you happen to know why that is, Micah? I don't know if there's like some insider stuff.
There's a lot of complaints that people levied towards certain things that were previously being in the platform not being in this version. I don't think it's purposeful that the position has changed so much as this is a document which is already very long, and they just put in what they think is the most salient on voters' minds and the most useful to inform Democratic rhetoric in there. And I imagine they didn't think that was the most salient, and so they didn't include it. They included new stuff. They always take out old stuff. Regarding the point about a Palestinian speaker, frankly, I actually agree. I think, there was a family of the hostages, or of some hostages, which spoke. And actually their message, which I don't think enough people acknowledge, was really good. It wasn't a hardline pro-Israel message. It was that they said, I believe explicitly, that a suffering competition has no winners. It's not about, Israel has suffered more, and therefore what's happening right now is right. There are people that are suffering, and our goal should be to end that suffering, right? But I think that a Palestinian speaker should have come as well. And I imagine the reason why they didn't allow a speaker is because there's been so many periods in the past in which people have said they're going to do something and then they decide to protest. And so I think there's probably a lot of suspicion from the very senior members of the DNC which make this decision, which is not even the DNC members. I imagine it's just Chair Jamie Harrison and a few others regarding a group which is kind of very well known for very publicly protesting. If you don't recall, some of the uncommitted delegates, of which there was only like 46, did try to smuggle in banners, and they actually even put it up during a Biden speech. Of course, those banners were snatched away from them, and they were quickly removed. Many of them took to complaining on social media that they were unfairly taken out of the DNC whenever they were holding very aggressive banners and protesting and yelling in the middle of speeches, which I imagine that kind of behavior played into that decision.
Yeah, I didn't read about the banners or what those banners said or anything. I think that Obviously with the issue of the Palestinian speaker, yeah, I think a lot of it probably comes down to paranoia about like this was the speech that we were going to give, and it was actually quite a reconciliatory speech. But then it's like, well, what if they get up there and start, saying things that Democratic Party insiders would be uncomfortable with? I think that I think the Democrats' like general line on this issue is going to be to try and talk about it as little as possible, because in part by speaking about it as little as possible, you allow sort of people to imprint what they want on it. Kamala in her speech, to be fair, I think she said essentially all she's ever going to say about this issue, which is, she's like, oh, Israel has a right to defend itself. Also, we need a ceasefire. And those were pretty much the two things.
Two-state solution, right? I mean, it's been
two-state solution, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I don't expect any of that to change a lot. I mean, I think I will say that I really do think that Democrats are a little too skittish on this issue. I really don't see what the catastrophic electoral outcome would be if you took a more pro-Palestinian stance. I really just don't see what the catastrophic electoral outcome would end up being.
I think you significantly underestimate how many people are on the other side of the issue. I think the Jewish coalition, the Democratic Party, is extremely strong. They are some of the most ardent Democrats around, and they don't necessarily have as nuanced of a position as I would like. Now, of course, not all Jewish voters are the same, but there are a lot of people that have a very hardline pro-Israel stance.
I mean, I think about but I mean, think about 2/3 of Jewish people vote for Democrats. I think there's not quite about as many Muslims as there are Jews in this country. I think that there's maybe 50% more Jewish people than Muslim people. And so if we're just doing a strict electoral calculus on like what position is more likely to get us more votes where, I saw a study recently that came out which said that the shift in Muslim votes from basically like 65% Democrat in 2020 to like 20% definitely voting for Democrat again because of the Israel-Palestine issue, that could actually be a much more major seismic shift. And I'm not talking about Kamala coming out and saying Israel's committing a genocide, we need to, destroy the state of Israel, right? But, coming out and being very forceful on a ceasefire, coming out and being very publicly critical of the actions of the Israeli government. I think stuff like that would probably play a little bit well. I mean, for goodness sake, even coming out and saying you want an arms embargo on Israel, right? That could play into arguably a broader base of people where there's even a lot of conservatives who say we should get out of the Middle East entirely. We shouldn't be funding any of these governments, right, in general. So it's not clear to me that on a strict electoral calculus, this would be disastrous. And in fact, I think it could be net beneficial. But
I will just say that based on polling in particular, like the ceasefire is extremely popular. People they just don't like having the war go on, and they do want it to end. I think it was a poll by Data for Progress, so maybe a little biased, but I think they found a small majority, like 50% of Democrat voters were willing to call what's happening genocide. So I think there's a decent portion of people that care pretty strongly in one direction. I think you're right, Micah, that some Jewish voters, but also just more broadly Zionist voters. I think sometimes we equate the two, and they're very much not equated. Zionist voters in the Democratic coalition, some would be antagonized, but I'm convinced that a lot of it can just come down to criticizing Netanyahu. If you want an easy target, either as a way to avoid explicitly criticizing Israel or Zionism, or as a way to specifically be able to highlight something bad that Israel has done recently, just criticize him. Like, call him a far right, call him an ethno-nationalist, and it gets you a little bit of, like, in my view, plausible deniability from saying that you're criticizing Israel.
I agree with that 100%. I think an arms embargo is because arms embargo is not just cutting off American aid. It's saying we're not going to sell you any weapons anymore, which the Israeli government relies on. And also, if it's really an embargo, it's stopping other countries from selling them weapons as well. So that is actually a very extreme position that I'm sure would be come with very severe electoral consequences. But eliminating all U.S. aid to Israel is a position that, personally, I think it's frankly common sense. I think it's ridiculous that we give these people anything for free. It's a rich country, and they don't listen to us at all. And They continuously do inhumane stuff.
Yeah.
So
No, it's
like,
it's so much like
think
it feels like Saudi Arabia to me, right? Like we give them all this military aid, and what do they do? A genocide. It's like what the fuck?
I feel like there's two criteria that we should have for giving countries military aid. First, you're the good guys, like you're clearly doing like the right thing with the aid, and then second of all, you're poor. Like look at Ukraine, right? They're the good guys, and they're poor now. They're completely broke skis. Israel, like it doesn't meet either of those criteria. Like, yeah, right. Hamas is bad, but Hamas is not civilians. Those 40 or 45,000 people that are dead right now are not they're not Hamas fighters, right? And Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, these are not just a normal Israeli government from the 1990s. These are people which Netanyahu came to Congress and basically spit on our country and disrespected us for over an hour and wants Trump to win. Wants to sabotage us, and seems like he wants to continue the war for his own political purposes. He tried to overthrow their own democracy. Like this is their Trump. And so I agree with you 100%, Estiel, that like we should absolutely be way more critical of Netanyahu. And I think we could take a much stronger position. I mean, our position should be conditioning aid at a minimum. Although I don't think what Uncommitted is asking for, which is an arms embargo, like sticking out a position where it's like, yeah, actually, no, we're anti-Israel. Like that
I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure people are saying arms embargo where they mean to say stop sending weapons.
That's what I'm heard it to mean.
I'm pretty sure
well.
It's a terminology issue because when you ask people what they want, they mean stop sending Israel bombs, and so like I'm pretty sure that the name for the request they have is not what they are actually requesting.
Yeah,
I'm
I don't
sure
think
some people do in fact want an arms embargo.
I don't think anybody's arguing for like the U.S. to enforce some sort of international Iranian style embargo on Israel. Obviously, there's a lot of potentially extreme positions that people could take, but I take arms embargo to mean just stop sending weapons to Israel. I think I agree with what you said, Micah, though, which is that the right-wing government of Israel has one of the issues that I have with all of the sort of military aid to Israel is that you have a right-wing government who seems to be creating the conditions for their own platform, right? Where they oppress the Palestinians. The Palestinians choose in their oppression not exactly very moderate solutions, let's say. And then they take that in reaction and say, this is why we need to oppress these people, right? And so by sending aid, obviously military aid to the government, it's almost like we're subsidizing their own government platform, right? Which is to create the conditions for their own advocacy, right? Which is obviously probably not a totally good idea. And after all, I mean, Bibi has taken, it seems like his government has taken some hedging positions in this regard, trying to get closer to governments like Russia, because I guess in their view, it's like, well, hey, if we can't get the weapons from America, we'll just try to get them from Russia. And it's like, I don't know, man, if you want to be all cozying up to Russia, then go for it. I think one thing that's also important to point out when it comes to the Israeli-American relationship is that the Israeli government has had historically one of the most aggressive counterintelligence campaigns against America of any government. You can look up, I think like half of the spies that we've caught spying in America are Mossad agents, right? Conducting intelligence operations in America, right? And that's obviously a pretty insane thing. I think there's also been a history of double agents getting found out to be working for the Mossad within the American government, which is pretty insane. And when you read about that, it seems like the explanation is that the Israeli sort of intelligence apparatus has an extreme level of paranoia, that even though they have a productive working relationship with American intelligence officials, they just simply don't really trust it. So they still try to implant these sort of agitating intelligence forces in America. And that's just insane. Like, that's crazy that they do that. And we still send them weapons. Like, what are you doing, fucking Israel? Jesus. But anyway, that's a whole tangent on Israel. Perhaps an episode for another day. But anyway, those are our thoughts. The DNC, I thought overall was pretty interesting. And I think overall you'll probably see people talk about a convention bump, but that doesn't seem to really be a thing. I think if there's any bump, it'll be so indiscernibly small that hard to say if it's just the general momentum that Kamala has or the DNC maybe caused it. Yeah, Micah.
I was very pleased. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Micah.
We should talk also about RFK's dropout. which is
so
very
We can
recent.
talk about that next.
Before we
STL.
move to that, I just want to say I was very pleased at the DNC actually to see Sean Fain. So he was one of the people on day one, and it was very striking to see like constantly there were like 5 or 6 speeches which talked about the working class, which is just a thing, like literally just a phrase you did not usually hear at the DNC.
Because
Fain
it's
talked about
Marxist, STL.
well, yeah, that's right. Only the Marxists talk about the working class.
That's true.
And funnily enough, even AOC, she only said the middle class, which is the usual Democratic translation to make it a little bit less scary. But Sean Fain talked about the working class. Cool, great. But he also talked about the 2028 general strike briefly, which I think we've mentioned on here, but I think is a unique way of getting around the legal challenges in the US. In the US, it's illegal to do a solidarity strike. You can't go on strike in firm A to support striking workers in firm B. But Sean Fain says, well, what if all of our contracts just so happen, they'll just happen, by happenstance to end on May 1st, 2028, Labor Day. And, it's perfectly legal to go on strike after your contract has ended. So if every union in this country, or at least a large number, all happen to have their contracts end on the same day, well, it's not a solidarity strike. It's not even a general strike, which is a happenstance, brothers. It's just silly coincidence.
Yeah.
So hoping some unions take his lead on that.
Good point. Micah, any final words on this before I guess we move on to RFK Jr.?
YIMBYs in control.
So true.
Obama spoke about the necessity of building more housing. Tim Walz in the past has spoken about the necessity of building more housing and for things like permitting reform. Kamala talked about the necessity of building more housing in her speech. This is a tremendous victory for the YIMBY movement, and a victory that I couldn't have imagined 2 years ago when I started organizing in my city. I remember whenever we were adding language to the Texas Democratic Party platform that was YIMBY in character, there was a fight. There was people who were against us and telling us that we just wanted deregulation and we were going to ruin the community of neighborhoods and make everything loud and it was terrible, and that exclusionary zoning was actually
God, I hate NIMBYs. I hate them so much. Anyway,
they literally said that. They said exclusionary zoning, that's what protects people from being next to concrete batch plants.
That's what protects people from being next to black people. That's what they actually meant by that statement, Micah.
Right.
God damn, I hate NIMBYs. I'm irrationally upset.
I know for a fact that some of the people that had an issue with us putting that in the platform, and it was passed successfully, were sitting in the crowd when they heard, some of our most prominent elected officials explicitly endorse the kind of stuff that we've been pushing for. Maxine Waters recently even said that there's these NIMBYs out there, and we don't need NIMBYs, we need YIMBYs. Obama's speech was supposed to include an explicit condemnation of blue NIMBY cities for their decisions and the red tape and the barriers they've erected that have blocked the development of housing. So we are in control, we are winning, and it's made me more excited than ever, honestly, to be a Democrat.
Yeah, we'll see. Obviously, Kamala's spoken about, deregulation and talking about liberalizing zoning. We'll see what that actually materializes as. Obviously, it could be quite a large potential range of things. But anyway, that's the DNC, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed us. Yeah,
I sent you a graph on it, just if you wanted to show on it. This is the polling average insofar as you trust polling, which I've unfortunately lost a lot of faith with, like the insane crosstabs. But if you trust polling, with a huge grain of salt, the average has shifted substantially for Kamala since she's announced, and possibly since the DNC, maybe about 1 percentage point. So
that's about what we expect.
That's not surprising. I mean, that's what I'm saying. If the convention bump is real, I mean, look at this, right? Like, if the convention bump is real, this appears to just be linearly going up. So it's not clear to me that this is like not just the momentum she would have had otherwise. I'm sure there's some amount of excitement, and maybe a quarter point, half a point of this could be directly attributable to the DNC. But I don't know. I mean, you can look at the RNC. The RNC appeared to have like no effect.
Something I think people have a lot of trouble with is realizing how partisan the environment is, that almost nothing shifts it. In this graph, you can actually see the Trump attempt on his life, right? And there's almost no impact in the polling. Like he gains maybe like half a percentage point at most, maybe a week after. That's it. Yeah. And that could just be random variation from other things, right? So it's ridiculous that being shot at can't change your polling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, frankly, it is nice to see that the American voters are more sophisticated in their thought process than many pundits originally appraised them to be. Because, yeah, somebody getting shot at doesn't change what their policy platform is. And I think the thing that many people didn't notice, and even at the time, many of us thought, oh my God, this is the end of the world, is that a lot of swing voters, I mean, you have to keep in mind, these are the kind of people which are very low information and very conspiratorial and very mistrusting of politics. They thought it was fake. I was called by some of my family members, which are kind of like my bellwethers for what swing voters are thinking. And they're like, yeah, that was totally fake. There's no way that happened. The fist? Are you serious? Does he think we're stupid?
A little too perfect, Micah.
And I was like, I don't know. Do I try to debunk this because I hate conspiracy theories, or do I just?
No, it is sort of funny that the natural conspiracism of independent voters leads them to the dumbest possible conclusion in our favor, I suppose, on the assassination attempt.
Yeah.
Non-fan mentions
Non-fan mentions the roll call. I think it was it Little John who was doing the roll call for Georgia or something completely insane. It was like, man, this is insane that this is happening. I love it. All right, RFK dropping out, Micah. What you wanted to talk about RFK Jr. dropping out. What do you think about this?
So this was supposed to be blockbuster news. The Republicans are going crazy about it. And the reason why they are is because RFK was taking something like 3, 5, 6% of the vote in swing states. And this vote, people were starting to discover, was probably predominantly coming from Trump. These people's second choice would be Trump over Kamala. So it's supposed to be a big deal. I actually don't think it is. I think that his lack of presence on the ballot is going to matter a little bit. But frankly, I think the vast majority of people which were saying they preferred RFK over Trump and Kamala were just double haters. There were people that are like, oh, I don't like the Democrat, I don't like the Republican. But Kennedy, ooh, that's the guy related to JFK. Sounds cool. They're not these hyper online RFK Jr. stands which think like vaccines give you like autism and there's alien space lizards that control society or whatever these people think. And so I think people are vastly overestimating how much RFK has control over his own base and how much RFK voters are actually loyal to him, so much as they're loyal to just not voting for the two major party options.
Yeah, I didn't think RFK would have a substantial impact, even if he stayed in the race. I think a generally pretty good rule of thumb is that third-party candidates tend to get about half of what they actually poll at, and he was only polling at, I think, about 4% when he actually dropped out. It just doesn't seem like that would have made a huge difference. If anything, like you said, it maybe took a little bit more from Trump, but him dropping out, it's like a lot of the people, the reason why third-party candidates get about half of the vote that they actually poll at is because there's just so many people who say, I'm going to vote for third party, that when they actually are faced with the ballot, they're like, I'm not going to waste my vote. I'm just going to vote for, one of the major party candidates. And so, like Micah said, what you probably end up with is a world that we probably would have seen anyway, with the people who said they would have voted for Donald Trump instead of RFK. They probably would have voted for Donald Trump over RFK when actually faced with the choice in the ballot. I just don't think it leads to, like, whether he stays in the race or not, I don't think the outcome is going to be particularly dictated by RFK's presence in the race. If anything, Trump, by tying himself directly to RFK and by all this speculation about RFK, I don't even want to say speculation. It seems like there's direct quotations that match up to this, of RFK potentially being nominated to serve in a Trump cabinet. I think that could actually hurt Trump because RFK is like an actually insane person, and he's probably not a great look to tie yourself to in various axes if you're the Republican nominee for president. Micah?
This is a guy who said he won't take sides on 9/11. He's a guy who dumped a dead bear cub in Central Park, and some evidence indicates that he stuck his hand inside of its mouth to touch its brain. He cheated on his wife 37 times and wrote it in a journal, which she found while she had, I believe, 5 kids, all of which were his own. He says antidepressants cause shootings. He committed sexual assault, and when asked about it, said, "Hey, I told you I had skeletons in my closet." He found a literal dead worm in his brain. Like in any other timeline, in pre-2016, people would be hiding this endorsement. Nobody would be proud of this. But JD Vance, Trump, they're like raising their hand with him, parading him around as like the true JFK Democrat. I mean, this is one of the most insane people in our politics. And y'all can clip this, y'all can bookmark it, and come back.
Ship it.
Go ahead.
Clip it and ship it, I said.
He's boosting you. He's asking
Clip it. Okay, come back to this moment. In 70 days, nobody will be talking about RFK. The only reason why he was a relevant character at all is because he was a potential spoiler for one of the two candidates, and he was running for president. Now that he's mostly off the ballot, it seems, he says he's coming off the ballot in the swing states. Maybe he's going to stay in a few because of the deadlines. No one's going to remember this guy because he's a random kook.
Well, that's what I did want to add. The one last funny note is because he's still on the ballot in some states, it's possible that where he is on the ballot, because he's fully associated with Trump, he may have an even greater anti-Trump effect, right? Because what Democrat is going to vote for Trump too? So I don't know. It's just particularly funny. I hope that he's on the ballot in every swing state and not in any of the other ones.
He also looks like a strong villain.
He looks like a
I think it's really telling, right, that the weirdest person on earth decided the Republican Party was for him, right? It really cements the legacy of the Republican Party as the party of weird people.
I think, it's really unfortunate that Trump has locked down the necrophile vote, the anti-vaxxer vote, and the brainworm vote. I don't know how we're ever going to overcome these huge constituencies that Donald Trump now firmly has in his camp.
Right. Yeah, it's also like somebody in the chat also mentions like the RFK Jr. voters are low information voters. We've kind of spoken to this a little bit. SDL's spoken to this a lot on his Twitter and on his streams and stuff as well when he talks about the idea of the Green Party being a spoiler for the Democrats. In some senses, this is true, right? That you would imagine it to be the case that a Green Party voter would rather the Democrats win than the Republicans win. It's kind of hard to imagine that a Green Party voter would be just indifferent between Republicans or Democrats. But the truth is, a lot of Green Party voters, if you just took out the Green Party option, just wouldn't vote, right? They just honestly wouldn't vote, right? And so there's always going to be a substantial sort of portion of these third-party candidates, even if in theory they could make the difference on getting a majority or passing the post, in the first past the post system, who honestly would just not vote, and they wouldn't actually make a difference in the spoiler effect. So it's very hard to say, although of course it's always reasonable to point out that they could have made a difference if they cared a little bit more. Unfortunately, they don't, but that is how it ends up being.
Jill Stein is going to get 1% of the vote. Last election cycle, the Green Party got 0.6% of the vote. And before that, they got 1.1% of the vote. These are the same people that are coming out every single time, voting for the Green Party, feeling really good about themselves and doing nothing to help our country. It's a lost cause. These people don't matter. These online leftists, which spend all their time, like Breonna Joy Gray, attacking the Democratic Party as if it's literally fascist, literally worse than Donald Trump. These people don't matter. These people do not matter. They are speaking in an echo chamber to their own folks. Normal voters are not seeing this stuff. And our job is to communicate to the people who are actually open-minded, who actually might and sometimes do vote for Democrats, and make sure all of them turn out, and every swing voter hears the message that we are the party of normal people, and the Republican Party is the party of crazy people. And hopefully they don't like that the Republican Party is the party of crazy people. In the case of RFK, they actually might prefer that.
I did just want to add one note on this, because sometimes I feel it can be either easy to it can be easy to monolithize your enemies, make them a single group that's saying one thing or the other. And I'm not saying you're doing that here, Micah. It's just that sometimes when there's a bunch of really dumb people that are very loud on the online left, it's easy to be like, that's the left. When you actually survey people, actually this is interesting. There's a pollster called the University of New Hampshire, and they did 3 polls recently of Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. And for once, they asked people an ideology that wasn't just conservative, moderate, liberal. They also asked about libertarian, progressive, and socialist. And so it's interesting. For once, we have a breakdown of how socialists are voting in real time. Do you want to guess the percent of socialists in these 3 states that are voting for Kamala Harris?
90%.
Almost. It's I think it's 88 or so percent, right? It's like, and then to be clear, the fun thing is the net margin for Harris is actually the same among socialists as among liberals and progressives, because a small portion, about 5% of progressives and liberals, say they're going to vote for Donald Trump. So the net margin among socialists for Harris is the same because they're voting for Stein, and Stein doesn't fucking matter, right? She's a net zero. So it's just,
that's a good point, and I think it's just the term leftist and left clumps a bunch of people which really have very different views of the world. You know, there's people like USDL, which I respect a lot. I think that you have a really good intentions and very similar values to me, and there's differences on policy, but ultimately you want to make the world a better place, and you're committed to a strategy by doing it, which is actually productive, which is engaging in the democratic process and organizing people. And then there is like the Marxist, Leninist, whatever as people who's like, it seems like their whole entire ideology is just hating Democrats, hating America, like liking China, Russia, Iran. I mean, I ran into some of these people outside the DNC that were holding a Hezbollah flag, calling people the F slur, and telling them that all the Americans killed abroad are Americans that deserved it because they're colonists.
Right? I will say, in fairness, there was actually a Nazbol, like there were like 10 or so people who were actual Nazbols who came. So it's possible you got some sort of crossplay there from the most insane possible kind of protester.
Right. And unfortunately, it seems like a lot of these really extreme people find their way to like leadership positions within organizations and proceed to misrepresent them. Right. Like DSA's International Committee was endorsing Maduro. Which is just a frankly ridiculous thing, and I know many DSA members.
What's funny is that got pulled within like 2 hours because the like central leadership of DSA was like, "What the fuck?" And got really pissed about it, actually.
Bro, and that's good, but there's a lot of these. Like, there's like the Marxist-Leninist caucus trying to take over chapter after chapter, do like purges.
Oh no, they've purged Micah's mic.
That's right, we purged.
Yeah, I know. They've gotten to me. But I mean, there is a lot of these people out there. They're hyper online. There's Brianna Joy Gray. There's Jimmy Dore. They're just very public. And I hope to see that they are separated from the left. Like, I think these people need to be disowned. They probably need to be separated by like some terminological differentiation, because ultimately these people are just totally different in terms of their worldview. From, I'd say, like more reformist-oriented left-wing people like you.
I guess. I mean, it's just that left and right are obviously big tent categories, right? So they're still part of the sort of broader left, but it's obviously quite an extremist portion of the broader left. I mean, just like how, you know, Nazis are part of the broader right wing, but obviously probably not emblematic of the sort of, you know, near median right winger. Anyway, last thoughts on RFK Jr., what we've just talked about, and then we got to go on to our wonky topics of the day, gentlemen. SDL.
I think, no, I'm just actually, there's something particularly funny about Trump, one of whose only signature achievements was Operation Warp Speed, was combining a whole of government approach to basically like limit some regulations, amp up some federal funding, get some private public partnerships. Like, this is actually sort of the ideal model of conservative or liberal partnership between government and private sector to race out a vaccine that's turned out to have like very, very small safety effects and a relatively massive reduction in mortality, like something like a 5 to 6 times reduction in mortality, right? Like one of the most remarkable life-saving products on earth rushed out in like a year. And now he has to distance himself from it because his audience and people like RFK are the older people voting for him. Like, what a joke.
It is funny that like the best thing that happened under his presidency is something that he has to disown. Like, he has to just own all the L's and like reject every single W.
It's one of the reasons why I'm pretty skeptical of the idea of like, oh, in a Trumpless primary, Nikki Haley actually does super well and she might become the nominee. It's like, guys, I don't think this is true. Like, I think in a Trumpless primary, Nikki Haley gets bodied. Who does she get bodied by? Whoever the most Trumpist guy after Trump is. That's who she gets bodied by. Now, Nikki Haley could become Trump. She could, like, adopt a lot of that rhetoric and end up winning. But then she's not really living up to, like, the Nikki Haley ideal of, like, the moderate sort of neocon that she, you know, aspires to be. And so I don't know. I just don't really see I don't see a moderate future for the Republican nominee, even if it's not Trump. And People laughed at this prediction. The polling proved me fucking 100% right. If Donald Trump was not in the race in 2024, Vivek would have been the nominee, okay? Because if you look at the polling, the Trumpless primary polling, he was a strong and close top contender. He was like, oh, he was polling at 27% and Haley was at 29%. I guarantee he would have been able to capture the extremist MAGA base because he was the most extreme person running in that primary besides Trump. You don't think they would vote for Vivek, but they vote for reality TV show star, right-wing, crazy person Trump? We think of Trump as a legitimate political player today because he is, but there was a time when Trump was an insane reality TV show star who'd been bankrupt several times, who cheated on his wives, who had no way he was going to win the Republican primary. He ends up dominating in the Republican primary in 2016. People who underestimate Vivek, I think, fundamentally misunderstand where the Republican base truly is. The reason I mention that is because SDL mentions Trump having to distance himself from his own accomplishment. That's because although the Republican base is sycophantically devoted to Trump, that's true. What they're more sycophantically devoted to is anti-establishmentarianism, or whatever you might call it. That's what they're sycophantically devoted to in whole part, right? And so whoever candidate fills that void in 2028, whether it's Trump or someone else, that's the candidate that's going to end up winning in 2024. These people who have hopes for a moderate Republican, all these people on Twitter that are coping, oh, when Trump's gone, we'll go back to the good old days of John McCain and Mitt Romney being our nominee. 0% chance that actually happens, if you ask me. Anyway, guys, all right, let's move on to our wonky topics of the day. So, first up, our audience. We had another audience poll. It was tied. It was tied between intellectual property and, what was the other one it was tied with? Oh, what kind of infrastructure spending is the best? Now, somebody suggested in the chat of this Patreon poll, again, patreon.com/the3wonks, if you want to participate in these polls, $3 a month. Someone suggested, why not just do both of these? Because it seems like an interesting topic, to have in our show. And honestly, that's probably a good idea. So we're going to talk about intellectual property first. Then we're going to talk about which kind of infrastructure spending is the best. Micah, what is intellectual property, and why is the concept of intellectual property something worth talking about?
So in the United States and Western countries, people have property rights. They're able to own stuff like cars and phones and the like, and that their right to own that thing entails that the government will protect that asset from being taken from someone else. They have the exclusive right to control that piece of property. And intellectual property expands the scope of property rights to include ideas. So if you come up with a new kind of medication, you can get a patent for that medication, and you are the only one that is able to produce it, or the people that you lease that property right to are the only ones that are able to produce it for a certain number of years. It's really important.
Oh no, we'll never know why it's really important.
Big patent troll taking out Micah.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can hear you now.
It's really important in order to give people an incentive to invent new things, because often inventing new things is really hard. And if there is no reward for doing so in terms of receiving some sort of right over that invention, then people are going to be much less likely to do so.
Exactly. Yeah. So in an abstract sense, one thing that you can look at in in various measures, right? You can look at sort of the strength of IP protections. And what you'll find is that the countries with the strongest sort of histories of innovation typically have the strongest IP protections. Now, some of this can be correlated with itself, right? That, well, the countries that invent the most might feel like they need more IP regulations. So, there's some sort of correlation between these two things. One is not necessarily causative of the other. But at the very least, even in that sort of Steelman case, it appears that there's sort of this sort of attitudinal need for IP laws to come on board at some point in a country's development activities. And so that's why it's a pretty important thing to talk about. Now, SDL, What are some of the problems with intellectual property? Why are we talking about this? I mean, Micah just said, well, this is a thing that's good and it helps people invent things. What are some issues that have been cropping up with regards to IP?
So I'll just mention two, and I know you have some to discuss as well. One is that intellectual property, like some types of property like land, makes it a monopoly. Intellectual property is by necessity a monopoly. You own the patent on something, it is difficult or impossible for competitors to produce a similar or identical product. That means that you either have monopoly power or very strong market power. And that generally is something that we don't like because it returns a lot of economic rents to one firm. Now, the argument for those economic rents is maybe if you give really big economic rents because you give monopoly power, those rents will be big enough to fund innovation. So you are willing to take a gamble on an innovative product because you want those rents down the road. The argument would go, those aren't really rents, they're payment for innovation in the past. That's actually one of the second problems, is that the payment that accrues from patents is in the future. You're essentially taking a gamble on a current innovation, hoping for the rents in the future, but you're not being paid for the process right now. And so this gets into the question of financing for innovation, that basically, rather than having direct payment for work on innovation right now, it all has to be financed on the possibility of future innovation based on the possibility of the product you're producing. That's just a generally hard problem. It's how much is a future patent or a future product work? It's worth. That's a very hard problem in general. Valuing anything in the future is difficult, much less a thing which doesn't even exist and has never existed. So these are some of the issues with patents, and I think you have two as well.
Yeah, exactly. So SDL mentions rents. I mean, we can think of economic rents. I think Micah put it as to say, economic rents are essentially a payment for what is not what we would traditionally consider a productive activity, right? For instance, I like talking about brand equity as a type of sort of economic rent market failure where, Apple can charge really high margins for their products, not necessarily because they're producing the best phones, but because they're Apple, and people have this sort of idea that Apple produces the best phone, and you can actually charge sort of exorbitant rates just based on that alone. Economic rents come from either market structures or failures. SDL mentions IP rights are essentially a monopoly. You're the only person that can produce the EpiPen in this way. People really need EpiPens. Therefore, you can kind of charge whatever you want for it, right? Because it's something people need, right? Or it's something that people really, really like Star Wars, right? You're the only person who can produce a Star Wars story because you own the rights to the intellectual property of Star Wars. Even if there's somebody out there who could write a better Star Wars story, they don't have the right to do that, right? It's a rent that you're able to charge as the owner of the intellectual property. And so one of the things that I mentioned in this regard is that in our sort of market-based system, this can cause inequality. It can cause inequality to access to things that you might need, like healthcare and other services, right? Like, because you're able to charge rents for this, it's a higher price. Therefore, the barrier to purchase that product is higher. Therefore, for poor people, it's much more difficult to access what might potentially be life-saving medication or health services or things that in general might greatly improve, I should say, your quality of life. And then it could be some things that we might consider a bit more trivial, but also kind of suck, things like entertainment and intellectual property where, it'd be cool to see somebody who is like an extraordinary storyteller be able to tell a Star Wars story that wasn't terrible, right? That would be awesome. Unfortunately, Disney does not allow people to do that because they own the intellectual property to Star Wars, right? And so it ranges from maybe more trivial things that are based on entertainment and leisure activities, all the way to very important things like basically what healthcare you can access. These create inequalities in society, and that's probably pretty bad. And so those are some problems that I think are associated with how we would, organize IP rights in general. And of course, the balancing act is what Micah mentioned, is that, some anarchists will say that intellectual property just shouldn't be a thing, right? As soon as you invent something, it is the common property of mankind, and that's just how it is. Now, of course, the problem that we could see with that, we see it right now in the international market with China, where, businesses don't want to do as much business as they used to in China because you open up a business in China and they just steal all of your intellectual property and then give it to all their state-owned enterprises. Then it's like, well, Jesus, why am I doing this business in China? Then SDL brings up the pretty solid counterpoint, which is like, well, yeah, like I guess they're doing that, but at the same time, this creates kind of a problem because you are earning rents from that intellectual property. So how do we address this balancing act, right? I mean, we don't like economic rents, but we want to encourage innovation. What do we do, Micah? What do we do? How do we reform our intellectual property system? Do we even need to reform it? Is it working just fine?
Well, the big problem is that we're basically rewarding people for innovating with monopoly rights. And as everybody knows, monopolies are bad. If you have a monopoly on a certain kind of drug, you can charge a much higher price than the optimal price, which means less people get the drug than they should. And of course, you're able to extract monopoly rents. And so ideally, we would find a way to compensate people the real value of their innovation directly once they've invented it. So like, bam, you invented the new drug, here's the value, you get paid, and now everybody can produce it. It's public property, and whoever's the most efficient producer will succeed in the marketplace. Prices will be low, people will get the drug, and basically the public will foot the bill. The difficulty is in appraising the value of your new innovation. That is very challenging. There's some ideas about how to do this. I'll talk about one. I'm sure you guys have others. One idea is to have all patent applications start with an automatic auction. So if the government says, yep, this is a new thing, this is eligible to be patented, there will be an auction in which anybody can submit a bid for how much they would be willing to pay for this property right. And so in 50% of cases, the highest bidder will receive the property right. They will pay the amount they listed, and that amount will go to the person who invented it. They will get the money. Yay, I sold it off, and somebody will have the property right. In the other 50% of cases, the government will pay the same price as the highest bidder. So what happens here? Why is this such a special system? Well, it basically eliminates 50% of intellectual property. It says half the time we will actually have public ownership of the patented technology, which means we're going to have faster economic growth, and we're going to get rid of 50% of the problem. Now, why would we keep it the case that 50% of the time somebody else would purchase the patent? Well, it's because we need to incentivize people to participate in the marketplace, right? No one is going to go place a bid for a patent or for anything if there's a 0% chance they're ever going to win.
Oh no!
An accurate number. If there's no chance I ever have to pay it, and so this is supposed to be like a compromise system where you can have an efficient valuation of intellectual property while reducing its prevalence.
Yep. So that's one option. STL.
Just to build out a little bit to give some idea on like the universe of potential solutions. What Micah talks about is the patent buyout alternative to intellectual property, or not really alternative. You could call it an augmentation or a modification, but it's somewhat an alternative to the current patent system where people take out utility patents. It gives them that right for a fixed period of time to have monopoly or close to monopoly rights over that product. The difficulty, as Micah said, is setting the price for that. So it'd be so simple, right? If the government could simply know the exact value of the good that you just produced, well, they could just give you the money. No big deal. How do you figure out that price? Micah gives one example of auctions. There are other suggestions. One is that you can have a scheme where the patent renewal fees rise over time. So it's sort of like the current system, but they would rise over time and maybe rise exponentially with time. This allows a way of setting the price. It's still a monopoly. It still has some of the same concerns that Micah raises. But you'd be strongly incentivized to get rid of that monopoly the moment that those rising fees cross how much you value the product at. So it's another way of doing it without auctions. It has inefficiencies in different ways. I don't know what my thoughts are on this one. I haven't read too deeply into it, but I just wanted to put it out there. The immediate alternative that's most obvious to the patent buyout system is probably some kind of Harburger IP taxation system. Sorry, Harburger IP property system. I just had ATM machine. Under a Harburger system, you would value property at X dollars, and you would pay a fee based on that, some proportion of that. So someone could buy that property out from you just by paying that. It's sort of like an ongoing auction process. Rather than an initial auction process, it's an ongoing one. For example, what we know with a lot of inventions is that their value is realized post hoc, after the fact. And so a problem with initial auctions is, let's say no one understands what your thing fucking is, well, then they will tend to substantially undervalue it. Or let's say you've just released the newest shitty AI model and everyone super overvalues it, well, then they'll way overpay. So that there's this problem with information at the point of the auction. What if you could extend that process out a little bit by 2, 3, 4, 5 years until the full duration of the property, and have the auction occurring at any point that someone can buy out the process from you?
Yeah,
I don't know if I go ahead.
Yeah, I think the advantage of a Harburger tax on this is that it just kind of addresses the both fundamental problems that we're talking about here. At least this is something that I think should definitely be a thing for, I mean, virtually all intellectual property. I think if for something like entertainment-based intellectual property, you could probably solve a lot of that by maybe having a Harburger tax, but also probably just like limiting intellectual property to a great extent. I mean, right now the intellectual property on entertainment is like
Ridiculous.
it's like life of the author plus 100 years or something. It's like just several multiple generate. Like we have to enter a new era of technology before we open up some of these intellectual property rights. Like it's just completely insane. And so probably just doing the simple solution of just greatly limiting the actual intellectual property rights that you have as somebody producing entertainment. Now, again, if you wanted to say, even if you wanted to say like, oh, life of the author, or if you wanted to say 30 years or something, like, you could do something like that. But life of the author plus several decades is just a completely ridiculous way to do things, in my opinion. Now, the Harburger tax, like SDL mentions, it kind of solves that front-end problem. It forces you to really intellectually understand, like, well, what is this really worth? And the implications of a Harburger tax is that the government's able to buy out that intellectual property right. A lot of people have problems with Harburger taxes because it's a forced sale, right? It's like, well, hey, you said this is worth $20 billion. I'm going to give you $20 billion for that, and you're obligated to take that price because you said that's what it's worth. I think people have less of a problem with the forced sale with intellectual property because you're not really buying like material things, right? You're open sourcing something essentially. When the government buys a piece of intellectual property, it's essentially just open sourcing that to anyone who wants to use it as they please. And it also solves the back end thing where, let's say that you value at 20% or at $20 billion, but the Harburger tax on IP is 10% of the value of your patent for each year that you keep your patent. Well, it's taxing that rent away from the intellectual property owner. So now there's a socialization of economic rents, or the rents are socialized in effect because this intellectual property is now open source. Anybody can use it as they want. And it solves the valuation problem because it just makes the patent holder value their product instead of having the government to, enforce this sort of complicated system of valuation, which would be very difficult for the government to do with opaque information. SDL?
I think Micah was about to speak.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on this idea. I think, so basically what you're doing is you're having an automatic option, probably on a yearly basis or every couple of years, where people, each place bids. And you basically, if your valuation of this intellectual property is lower than someone else's, if I say it's worth $1 million, they say it's worth $2 million, I'm forced to sell it. That's how Harburger taxes work, right? So I only get to keep holding on to the property so long as I value it more than anyone else. That is a valuable process if you think that there's a distributional efficiency issue, right? Basically like, hey, people are holding on to this intellectual property when they really aren't the most efficient users of it. And so the Harburger automatic auction process may lead to intellectual property going to where it is best used. And then you add in this tax element where now I have to pay a certain percentage tax on the valuation that I provide to the property. And what it seems like is going on here is you're just reducing the value of the property right? So like, a property tax reduces the value of owning a piece of real estate. A phone tax, let's say there was a 1% tax on the value of your phone, would make you want to own phones less, right? It would make that property right less valuable. And the fact that intellectual property is the reward for innovation means that a tax on it diminishes the amount of that reward, diminishes the incentive to innovate. Now, the benefit, I suppose, of this tax, which is supposed to ratchet up every year, like, the first year it's like 1%, and then it goes up to 1.5%, or however the rate structure works, is that it encourages people to eventually relinquish their intellectual property when it's no longer worth it's not valuable to hold it anymore. But I think that people need to acknowledge is certainly a trade-off of values. You're basically saying we're going to weaken intellectual property rights, and we're going to have this administrative process to try to increase the efficiency of their distribution. That might be worth it.
Yeah.
There are questions about whether the distribution of intellectual property rights is really inefficient today. That's a question that I have. I don't know if it's actually inefficient today. If it's not inefficient, then it's not really worthwhile to have this automatic auction process. And whether a kind of a tax on the value of the property is the most efficient way to reduce the value of those intellectual property rights, or just shortening the number of years might be a much simpler approach that could be preferable.
So I think that Micah points out something that is somewhat important to point out, which is, well, obviously we're lowering the sort of, if you were doing the net present value sort of calculation on what is the value of this patent, and you were doing this valuation yourself, you'd have to internalize the cost of the tax within that valuation, right? Hey, the expected cash flow of this asset, this intellectual property, is going down because if you keep the asset, assuming the government says, hey, we don't want to buy this for $48 billion, but you're going to pay, say it's a 10% tax, you're going to pay $480 million a year in order to maintain this, this whatever the cost of this, and maybe that escalates over time. Like SDL said, it kind of depends on the exact construct. That's true, but I don't think, for two reasons, I don't think that would lead to sort of substantial reductions in investment. The reason why you might expect it to lead to substantial reduction in investment is because, well, you're sort of raising the hurdle rate of return of these properties by lowering the return overall on intellectual property. But I think that that's where partly we can use our sort of basic empirical examples that we have. We have many examples of resource rents, for example, being taxed, right? And of course, people still extract resources because even though you're not able to extract rents, you're still able to extract sort of accounting profits from various productive activities. You're just not allowed to extract rents from the productive activity associated with intellectual property. So that's number one. Number two, I think that, of course, what we also need to mention is how do we subsidize research and development on the front end, right? That's really important as well, because I'm sure that we would all agree that the ways in which we subsidize research and development and the amount should probably be drastically changed. That changes the hurdle rates for investment as well. Of course, we can internalize that lack of cost in our valuation process as well if we were to inject substantially more money into research and development. SDL?
Just to speak to that, so the systems we've sort of discussed so far are utility patents and, kind of discussed a little bit copyrights, which are related. So utility patents, which are just fixed term monopoly on a product. We've discussed patent buyouts. We've discussed renewal fees that rise over time, various forms of hardware taxation. There's also two more, and this is why I was raising it, because they're getting into what Econobo is talking about. It's either just funding research directly. I mentioned that one of the problems with patents is that they return a reward after you've patented the product. But let's imagine there's a product that takes 20 years to create, like a really long research cycle. Well, you're not getting any money until the end of that. So that means you need some additional funding source during that all that time period. Well, where are you going to get that? Unless you can take out a loan from someone who believes in your very long-term project, the answer is you don't. You don't get that funding. There are an enormous number of things which are potentially patentable very far in the future, which do not get funded for obvious reasons, because businesses cannot credibly assess the value of your future asset. They're not going to let you take out a loan. So one of the solutions for this is just funding research directly right now. Some very large corporations can do this. Famously, Bell Labs did this sort of basic research, very long time frame research, but only very large corporations that can expect a near monopoly status where anything that benefits their sector will benefit their profits can afford to do something like this. The only other entity that can really do it is the state, is the government, because they get taxes from everything. If the economy goes up, they get more money. So it's beneficial. So just basically, public funding can solve some of these issues. Let's imagine you had the hardware tax money plowed right back into research funding of some kind. Well, this could resolve some of those issues that, yes, you've reduced the value of the IP, but you've decreased the cost of research. And so there's a trade-off there that may equate out to be positive in favor of research. More broadly, and this can get some to the research of it, there's some evidence that public research seems to have higher rewards than private research, generally because it's further up the chain, by which we mean it's closer to basic research, like coming up with an idea ex nihilo from nothing, or taking very basic concepts and putting it into something that's workable. And private research becomes more and more feasible the closer you get to actually producing a patentable product. If you want to research something that's 1 year to market, no problem. You can find a company to finance that. 5 years, much harder. 10 years, pretty much impossible. When you're talking about things that are 10 years away, it's like 90% government funding. So all this is to say, public funding is the other way to square this circle. I will just add, one of the concerns with public funding, again, is sort of the inverse of the patent buyout problem. How do you decide which to fund and how much to spend? Like, how do you decide which researchers or which firms or whatever to spend money on? And how much money should each of those get? These are actually really difficult problems. There's also principal agent problems. Let's imagine you just gave a stipend, and this is sort of the extreme case, a stipend to every researcher in the country. Well, everyone's just going to become a researcher and then do shit. They're just going to shirk. You've basically given everyone a UBI if you just call yourself a researcher. So there's this problem of principal agent problems as well. And some of those are resolved by designing public research programs that have like fixed goals. You have to publish, for example, if you get a lot of federal government research, you have to publish an article, you have to provide your research publicly to the public, like the data has to be public. There's a lot of these sort of like metrics that reduce those concerns. But there are real concerns. Just to add sort of the final twist on this, one of the ways to get around some of those concerns is rather than funding specific researchers, is to fund a specific product. This is called the prize system. So let's imagine you want a cure for HIV/AIDS, and you say, I'm going to give $3 million to the guy who can come up with a cure. I'm going to give $3 billion to the guy who can come up with a cure. And I've got all these little sub-awards for people who can come up with components, which seem like a promising way of stepping towards the HIV/AIDS. Well, then you've got some of the concerns with patent funding being far away, if you've got these little sub prizes, and you've given a reward that's a non-monopolistic reward to whoever does invent this product. You've essentially done the reverse of the patent buyout system.
Putting bounties on diseases, if you will. Yeah, I think that these are all probably decent ideas. I think something that Micah might talk about, we've talked about this a lot in our show before as well, is like sometimes sometimes a simpler solution, just tax reform, can help with this to some degree. This is part of why neoliberals talk about full expensing so much, right? Part of that full expensing isn't just capex, right? Sort of investment and sort of material, depreciable assets over time. Part of that's also R&D, right? That you can't necessarily fully expense your research and development costs, because in theory, obviously, that research and development expense has returns in the future from new ideas, capital efficiency, technological innovation that are coming out that you can, of course, have intellectual property rights on. But just allowing companies to fully expense their R&D in the years that they experience their research and development expense, that's in effect a subsidy, right? Because you're not having to spread out that loss of income over a longer period of time, which is really, really important. And then if you did the more simple sort of tax structure of just subsidizing losses directly, right? And saying, hey, any amount of money that you end up losing per year, that's just a check that you get for the government times the tax rate. If you lose $1 million and the tax rate is 20%, we're just going to give you a check for $200,000. You could compartmentalize that and say, for qualified research expenses, which is something that we do, you have to come up with buckets of qualified research expenses. We're going to give you some subsidy equal to X percentage of qualified research expense, right? Again, this is just a way to subsidize research and development. And you could compartmentalize it in the way that STL said as well. Hey, for every dollar that you spend on opening a lab that researches pharmaceutical solutions to cancer, we're going to give you 30% of your expenditure on that process back, right? If it costs $20 million to open this lab, we're going to give you, I chose a hard number, we're going to give you $6 million back on your not on your taxes necessarily, but we're going to give you a check just to make it simpler. These are all ways on the front end to make that sort of initial investment decision much easier on the investor, or on whoever ends up having the money, even if it's a nonprofit or whoever it ends up being. Micah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I think ultimately patent prizes have a place. Public funding for research and development has a place. Tax reform, as you said, is essential. There's no reason why we should be imposing a tax on research and development and discouraging one of the most beneficial economic activities there is. Furthermore, fixing the way that we treat losses to make it where you can carry them over infinitely instead of like only having a limited carry forward ability, and allowing them to increase them at the rate of the risk-free rate of return. Effectively, it'd be the exact same thing as what you're proposing, which is directly subsidizing losses. That's beneficial. And modifying the terms of intellectual property, shortening the number of years where appropriate. I think all those things would be beneficial. One idea that I've considered and that we haven't talked about is the idea of requiring every holder of a patent to list a price at which they would lease the intellectual property to others at. So, I have a new patent for a specific kind of camera. The government will require me in that patent application to list a specific yearly rental price that any company could pay to me to also be permitted to use the intellectual property. And I think what that would do is it would increase the likelihood that any specific patent is held by multiple firms at the same time, therefore reducing kind of the monopolization over essential patents. Of course, you could always list a price for that patent that's ridiculously high, right? Like, let's say, I came up with this really new this great camera, and I want to be the one person who produces it. I could list that the yearly rental price for acquiring it would be $1 billion. I could do that. But maybe I would be really happy if somebody paid me $100,000 to lease this patent from me. And just being able to list that allows a really easy way to transmit information to others. So any company that's like, wow, it seems like a really cool idea, could at any point in time enter into that contract with me without any sort of complex negotiation process. It would reduce those information costs and make transaction more efficient, therefore reducing the monopolization over certain forms of intellectual property.
Well, and just to extend that a bit, you can easily, I think, add a Harburger element to that as well. That the price that you're valuing it at, you could set the lease rate either as a multiple of that, or you could separately set the lease rate and then require people to pay something relevant to that lease rate. I'm sure the math there is actually more complicated, but the point is that you could tax people in the same way for setting a lease rate too quote unquote high, presumably.
I frankly don't think it's too much of an issue. Like, I guess the idea around the Harburger tax is that people are going to be dishonest and set the price too high.
But then they just pay a super high rate of taxation, right? So it's
that's why you have to have the tax incentive. Yeah.
Yeah. You're muted, Micah.
You're muted, Micah.
Silent Mike. That's what I call him. You're still silent, Micah. Rest in peace. Man, Micah's he's been struggling with IT problems, man.
Micah's camera didn't want to work with him. It's still muted.
You're still muted, friendo. My God.
Try unplugging and replugging it.
We might have lost Micah. Before the show, he bought a nice camera, and he was like raging because he couldn't get it to work properly. And look, I feel for Micah. I get irrationally much more upset than Micah did when my tech doesn't work. I'm just like, why can't things just work? Perhaps if we had... Nope, we can't hear you, Micah, still. Perhaps if we had an intellectual property system that wasn't terrible...
Hello?
Hey, we can hear you now.
Well, perhaps I literally hate my life. I can't do this anymore.
Perhaps if we had a better intellectual property system that was more competitive, Micah's mic would work a little bit better than it does now.
So I was talking about the value of the Harburger tax idea. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is there really a strong incentive for people to lie about how much they value something, right? Because whenever I say, let's say this camera I got that you're talking about, right? I didn't buy this.
Got to show it off.
This was lying around, but this is worth like maybe $1,000 to me, right? If somebody asked me how much is this worth, I'd say $1,000. And that means if somebody came around and they said, Micah, I'm willing to pay you $1,100 for this camera, I would be happy because they're going to give me more money than it's worth. I don't have an incentive to say this is worth $2,000 because then that would keep me from getting, positive sum transactions. Then people that would only be willing to pay $1,500 wouldn't tell me that they're willing to pay $1,500 because they'd be like, well, he wouldn't be willing to take that.
Well, so in particular, one of the reasons in the Harburger tax you care about the total cost is if you want to have government buyouts, right? Then there's a strong incentive to lie upward the price so that when the government's like, we value this patent. Go ahead.
Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. Although I'm saying, like, in the context of the system that I'm proposing, there's not government buyouts. Like,
Well,
I'm saying we modify the terms of it, and we have people list a price, so you have that hardware element of transmitting more information outwards. But there's no need for the tax because the government's not a buyer.
Well, that's sort of a related problem with the auctions. Like, I could presumably see some way of you would have firms that compete to raise the total price of the value just so that the government gives the person more money. I don't know if that's like you basically want to have firms raise ridiculously high rates that they never intend to pay, or firms which are de facto colluding. I know that's mostly like a regulation problem, but that's sort of the concern is there's an incentive to raise the price higher if the government's willing to pay at any price.
But in my system, the government's not buying any patents.
Sure. I'm just like, if you're trying to merge the patent buyout system for public IP and like a Harburger tax, that's the.
If you are trying to do both of those, then you probably should. Yeah, I mean, there's an issue with that idea.
I mean, I don't really see. I honestly don't see this as a huge problem. I mean, if the government was buying these things out, I mean, the government isn't like. I mean, the due diligence of these deals is not like. I feel like oftentimes we imagine the government being substantially less competent than they actually are. Now, of course, the government is not, the government is able to make mistakes just like private industry actors, of course, make mistakes when it comes to buying things that might be less or more valuable than they actually are. In the due diligence process for this type of deal, the government might say, you're saying that this patent for the EpiPen is worth $15 billion. Okay, sure. Well, the value to us from the government's perspective of the tax revenue associated with this $15 billion times 10% per year for 10 years or whatever, $150 million a year. If it goes up by 1%, we internalize that calculation as well. The discount for the rate for the government is probably going to be substantially lower because obviously it's the government. You have access to much more capital than a private industry does. There's also a matter of what, funds you have available to purchase those patents. That's one of the reasons why I feel like the tax on intellectual property rents should probably just go into the same pool that they can use to buy out other patents in the case that they actually want to do this because they need to have a credibly sort of regular source of funding for this, and it would be a shitload of money that you'd be giving out because obviously if we taxed all intellectual property like this, that'd be a lot of money going into this coffer. So you'd have a credible threat of government buyout, and they'd have to come to a mutual agreement to buy out patents at that point. I don't think the government, I don't think on a newly sort of, I don't think on a technology that was recently patented, the government would say, yeah, I'm willing to spend $20 billion on an unproven technology. No, I'd rather just take the $2 billion worth of rents each year because that's what you're agreeing to pay by submitting this value to the IRS. Like, I think that this system would just work out substantially better than we might imagine. I know that there's obviously some theoretical problems, but I really feel like it would just work out super well.
Source my feelings. Source vibes.
Well, no, but it's a matter of understanding the valuation and like the typical due diligence process for any sort of transaction, right? M&A transaction or acquisition that a government or that two businesses might make. I just don't think that. Because the beauty of a Harburger tax is that it's a mutually agreed upon price, right? That like the company is agreeing to sell this product at this price, and the government has the option. And I guess in theory you could open this up to other actors if they really wanted to, but it would just have to be open source at that point to open source the technology. I mean, I just think that this would work out pretty well. I mean, of course, you could start small and say Harburger tax only applies to, let's say, entertainment, because we care the least about the impacts on entertainment production. It applies to entertainment. Let's just see how it works out. But I think that this kind of system would work out very well. Unfortunately, the Harburger tax is much like the land value tax, where there's a lot of theoretical reasons to think that it would work out substantially well, but there haven't been many pulled triggers in regards to actually implementing this type of tax. So the empirical evidence is a little bit more scant than we would like, I imagine.
Well, I did just want to add that is one of the reasons you care about correct pricing as well, Micah, is private buyers, right? Like you were mentioning that it's important to have a lease price just be public so that you can easily just get the lease price. You don't need to enter negotiations with the company. You just pay it. Well, now you can make the camera. That's sort of the same reason you want a known cost for a patent that you don't need to enter negotiations into. Like, you're just looking at the patent list. This one's worth $2 billion.
Right. I think you should have to list that too.
Well, that's my point. That's why a company would want to, you care about it being listed accurately. So that companies don't have an incentive to over raise it to like benefit their bargaining position, right?
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is, if the government's not a buyer, right? Like, the reason why the hard-worker tax is an important idea, in the case of the government being a potential buyer, or in the case that there is, I suppose only in the case that the government is an actual buyer, there's this idea that the government will pay whatever the valuation is, right? Whatever the highest valuation is. And so you really need, there is really this incentive for them to put it at an inaccurately high level, right? I only value the camera at $100,000, but we're going to put it at $500,000.
There isn't though, Micah, because you'd have to pay. You're running the risk of paying so much more in tax.
Micah's talking about a Harburger without a tax, like where you're just self-valuing, but there's no.
What I'm saying is the point of the Harburger tax in that context,
gotta have the tax,
is to make sure that people don't have an incentive to have a ridiculously high valuation for the camera. Right? It's only worth $100,000 to me. I put it at $1 million. Now I'm paying all this shit ton of fucking taxes, right? But if we don't have a context in which there's some government buyer out there which is going to pay automatically the highest price, and it's just private actors, you don't really have an incentive to lie.
Well, you do.
Right?
So the problem is that because there's informational asymmetry, there's a lot of reason to believe you'd want to amp up the value of your product. Like, it's the same reason that you basically want to say this product is really valuable. I, as the inventor, I really understand the science behind it. I understand the applications, and it's worth 20% more than what you think it is because you're just uninformed on this. And so that's like, this is what I was bringing up earlier with the idea of an initial auction. A problem with a lot of innovations for this is that the value of the innovation is only realized 3 years later when someone puts it into mass production. It's only realized 3 years later where someone like combines it with some other product. And so go ahead.
This is another idea. I think that we should have like evergreen patents that aren't used for a certain number of years scheduled to automatically expire, which will incentivize people to go out and find somebody who can use this stuff and sell it. Because we've seen so many protective patents filed by big companies like Samsung, which spend a bunch of money on acquiring these patents and then don't use them specifically to make sure nobody else uses them. So that will have an incentive to make people be more accurate about the price, because you need to get rid of this, and you need to get rid of it like pretty quickly, right? And I think going back to the camera example, if this is really worth $1,000 to me, I don't have an incentive to list it at $2,000. Maybe I have an incentive to list it at like $1,200 because I think I can get it for that much. But if I only have a certain number of years where I could sell it, eventually, if nobody buys it at that price, I'm going to have to lower it. I'm going to lower it, and the floor is going to be.
So I think you're right that limits market inefficiencies, but the point is, what if we could just go to zero inefficiency, or as close as we can get, right? Like, why not just avoid many of these issues by having forced Harburger tax, right?
The Harburger tax.
Sorry, I think
also went down. What's that?
Economo was about to speak, and we've been.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, both of these approaches also greatly tamp down patent trolling, right? One of the reasons why patent trolling is a thing is because it's free, right? You can just file a bunch of bullshit patents, and you don't have to pay any taxes associated with the valuation of those patents. Now, in theory, you could always say, well, hey, the value of this patent is 1 cent, and so your tax is infinitesimally small. But then in either system, well, guess what, dumbass? I'll just pay the penny for your patent, and now your financial return on this patent troll has gone to essentially zero, right? The financial incentive to patent troll basically goes to zero, which is a way that you could end patent trolling without having to do complicated like reorganizations of your patenting system in and of itself.
Sorry, and Micah was about to speak on this application.
Let me just be clear here. I don't dislike the Harburger tax.
Let me be clear. Yep.
I do think though that it's just like, it's one of those things where it's really wonky, like really complicated. It's arguably much more wonky than even land value tax, because you do have to set up like this accessible system where people are setting up automatic bids on things that are really complicated. And like, you need to have people that actually understand what these patents are for. Most patents are not simple stuff. So you're probably going to have a lot of information on what this thing does, right? So it's not like the auction's like, oh, easy, no problem. Like, it's gonna cost money to do this. It's going to take time to try to get people to actually place bids in this process. And the big problem that I don't think people acknowledge is that the tax itself reduces the value of the property right. It is not just a purely like this thing where it's like, okay, it just makes them put the accurate value on.
Well, we acknowledge that though. We talked
valuation.
about subsidizing research more, and
You did. Right now I'm talking to SCL because he just said, well, why don't we have it perfectly accurately valued? I'm saying, well, there's this trade-off.
Well, sure, perfectly accurate, but then you would subtract a percentage off, right? Like I think most investors can understand that kind of thing. Like it's the same as buying land. Like yes, you understand that the land value is reduced by property tax, but that doesn't mean that you aren't in understanding.
Your valuation is still very able to be done, obviously, but I don't think that's necessarily what Micah is doing. He's just saying that the hurdle rate for investment is going to change.
What I was trying to get, what I'm trying to get at, Micah, is I don't care about the true value in the sense of economically untaxed. I care about the misrepresentation of whatever that multiplied value. Yeah.
I understand. I'm saying there's just a trade-off here, and it all depends on your descriptive view of reality. There's a trade-off between the accuracy of the prices in the marketplace for this pieces of intellectual property, which affects distributional efficiency, like how efficiently the property rights are distributed, versus the actual strength of the property rights and the incentive, the incentives they provide to produce, and also the like dead cost, the administrative cost of actually setting up this marketplace and actually having it perform its function, which requires a lot of government information gathering.
That's what I know that you and I have previously talked that one of the strongest cases for the state setting up a market is generally in places where information is really low quality, right? That actors in the market are not able to reasonably sort between the options on themselves, that you need some sort of structure or guidance that one, forces greater disclosure from the seller, and two, provides greater information to the buyer. So it just seems like this is one of those cases where if we think that markets are efficient for intellectual property, which I'm to be clear, it's actually really hard to tell what the economic benefits of patenting versus not patenting are. I think Economy mentioned, there's a lot of endogeneity with these things that we see. In fact, one of the oddities is we often see research and development spending go up before patenting goes up. So is patenting causing the increased return, or people raising their investment because they expect future returns from patents?
One of the reasons that it's probably worth mentioning, one of the reasons why at least I specifically haven't been referencing studies and literature on this is because the literature on the actual sort of utilitarian calculus of patents is amongst the most mixed literature in all of economics. It is extremely unclear in the economic literature if it is even a good thing to have patents, or at the very least, if it is a good thing, to what degree is it good to have patents, right? Extremely controversial, not necessarily controversial, but super duper mixed results in the literature.
Can I add, there's I think a banger quote from a much older paper, 1951. Quote, "If national patent laws did not exist, it would be difficult to make a conclusive case for introducing them. But the fact that they do exist shifts the burden of proof and is equally difficult to make a really conclusive case for abolishing them." It's sort of one summary of the literature, that there's plenty that find positive results and plenty that find negative or neutral results. And it's really hard to be should there be radical shifts in the fundamentals? I think one of the benefits of stuff like the Harbinger tax is it lets you get at starting to change those things without super duper changing it. You've basically changed the pricing mechanism, you've slightly altered the incentives, but these are all mostly marginal. You've kept the whole thing intact as a whole. You still have patents, you still have monopolies.
At this point in time, I just think that the distributional inefficiency that Harbinger taxes are supposed to solve in terms of intellectual property are not that big. And I think the cons probably outweigh the pros compared to not the existing system, compared to my system. And my system has a bunch of public R&D, has patent prizes, has publicly listed prices, has automatic expiration of evergreen patents that are unused, and also has shortened patented terms. So compared to my theoretically optimal system, I don't think it's, I think it's worse, but I still think it's probably it's very likely it's better than what we're doing today.
Can I add? So one of the few studies that I thought really came to some interesting causal evidence around patenting is I'll post in the chat, but it is this study, Babina et al. It's very recent. What they looked at is federal funding shocks to a given sector. So the federal government is like half of the research in this country, something like that, or like a third. It's a big player in R&D. And suddenly, sometimes the federal government will randomly cut funding to a field by like 30 to 40 to 50 to 60%, and then put it back the next year. And this is actually a very convenient. This is bad, as the article proves. This is bad, but it's actually very convenient for researchers because this is sort of like the ideal causal effect, right? Like 1 year you've got research at X, and the next year you've got it at 0.5x, and the next year you've got it back to X. So what was the effect of like suddenly shocking the system? And their results in this study were that there are significant reductions in two things we really care about, and a significant increase in something that we don't care about. This is why I'm saying it's relating to patents. They had three outcomes. One is the rate of people who were recipients of this funding that then went on to become an entrepreneur in a high-tech field. That means joining like a new startup business. That went down significantly. The effect, they argue, of federal funding shock cuts is on the order of a reduction of like 5% of all entrepreneurs in high-tech businesses. It is like ridiculously high. Two is that there's a major reduction in papers published, which are an indicator of like high quality research. And there's a huge reduction of high citation papers and papers which are like, they have a bunch of metrics to measure like high quality papers. Those all go down quite substantially. Again, on the order of like 2, 3, 4, 5%. But the interesting thing is patents went up. But they qualify this. Patents went up after federal funding goes down. So this suggests that people, they're clearly being more productive, right? They're producing more intellectual works because that's what patents are. They're intellectual works. Well, the problem is the patents, again, if you try and striate based on high quality versus low quality patents, they produce a lot of low quality patents. And in particular, half of those patents are linked to a specific private funder for that research. So what happens is the federal government goes away, and they show this because they have linked data on individual people. Private funding goes up because you talk to a company and you get a patent on your work. But the problem is other people don't cite this patent. You're just giving work that was already close to production a patent. You were already working on it. The work was already out there. The intellectual work was already being done. It's just that now you put a patent on it. And high quality patents for no impact whatsoever. So I guess this is one of the things that leads me to question, we might call this sort of stuff patent trolling, or just like low quality patents. It leads me to question that a lot of these parts of the patent scheme are truly effective in building up like a high information, high productivity economy. If what we care about is transitioning people into actually building the firms that use these damn products, well, it seems like sometimes cutting public funding really, really fucks with that. But patents don't actually seem to enable that. But I know this isn't getting at the broader question of like, are patents useful? But it does just show, in my opinion, a pretty strong causal evidence. And I don't want to spend the whole time talking about the study, but pretty strong causal evidence that patents alone are not the same thing as like enhancing startups or enhancing innovation or enhancing scientific publication.
Any last words on this before we move on to infrastructure? We've been talking about this for about an hour. I do need to leave in the next, 30 or so minutes. So any last words before we move on to infrastructure?
I'm just going to have the rundown really quickly once again so people can write this in their policy notes pages, which I hope you all have. And I have a policy notion page, which is a series of subpages on every single area and every single good policy and all of the research that I have that supports it. So I hope that you make your own version and then you link the relevant 3 Wonks video underneath it that you can cite. So we like patent prizes sometimes whenever there's very long time horizons for the innovation that needs to occur. We like public R&D funding for basic research. We like publicly listed lease and sale prices for patents. We like, I think, the automatic expiration of patents that are unused, right? We all agree on that?
Of course.
We want to change IP terms because they're too dang long sometimes. And we want to crack down on patent trolling.
Yeah.
And some of us want to tax it.
I mean, to be fair, we all agree that the rents associated with IP are bad. You just have a different way of essentially collectivizing those rents versus the Harburger tax. But anyway, that's our thoughts on intellectual property. Obviously, it's probably an important component as some inherent structure in your economy. But of course, the ways in which you organize that are liable to be substantially different depending on what your exact outcomes, your exact desired outcomes are. All right, next up, gentlemen, we are talking about infrastructure spending. Which kind of infrastructure spending is best? This was the Patreon topic. Patreon.com/the3wonks. If you want to become a fellow 3Wonk Patreon member and have a say in what we talk to on a week-to-week basis, some weeks like this week, the Patreons actually picked entirely what we talked about. Intellectual property was what we talked about right before this. Now we're talking about what kind of infrastructure spending is best. An overview. Why do we even care about infrastructure spending, and why does big government need to be involved in infrastructure spending? I'll go first on this one. So why do we care about infrastructure investment? Infrastructure investment fundamentally enables economic activity, right? So that's one of the reasons why we like infrastructure investment. We like enabling economic activity. Why do we like enabling economic activity? Because economic activity is what allows us to live the sort of cushy or not very cushy lives that we lead. It kind of comes down to economic activity, whether it be, socialized, privatized, market-oriented, non-market-oriented, whatever it might be. It's all the economy, right? And so infrastructure investment that enables that economic activity is important. And there's also a lot of sort of non-tangible benefits to various infrastructure. Some of the examples of, things that might develop human capital in some ways, but don't necessarily directly involve economic activity. They might just sort of improve your general quality of life. Things like community centers, parks, public beaches and public pools and things like that, right? These are things that maybe it's not as clean that they're improving your economic circumstance, but they're definitely things that it seems like intuitively most people value. It's a part of infrastructure as well. And my answer as to why big government needs to be involved in infrastructure is kind of what SDL said in our previous segment, I should say, about intellectual property. There are just certain kinds of investments that private actors have a very difficult time doing. Infrastructure is one of those things. It's just a really expensive thing to do, right? A lot of infrastructure projects are very expensive. It's also not necessarily clear the payoff for a lot of infrastructure investment. And it's also not necessarily clear that a lot of infrastructure that we want to be invested in should be behind a paywall rather than just sort of an openly available piece of infrastructure. Like a lot of people, a lot of wonky people like the idea of making every highway a toll road because, surge pricing and demand pricing is based, and oh my goodness, how awesome is that? But you go to an average fucking person on the street and tell them every highway is going to be a toll road, and they're going to call you a dumbass, right? Because no, we hate toll roads. Most average people think that a lot of infrastructure should be a public good of sort, or, at the very least free at the point of service, right? And so that's why big government probably inherently needs to be involved. Thoughts, guys, on the overview? Why is infrastructure spending something worth caring about? And why does big government need to be involved?
I mean, one of the other answers is just that there's a multiplier, that infrastructure spending generally enables economic activity, but the person charging the rents on the road can't encompass all of the benefits of that economic activity because it's not private. So it's positive externalities. Yeah.
I think there is a fundamental problem of certain forms of infrastructure in the sense that you can't charge for it. You can't charge people to enter the sidewalk in front of their house. Or to walk places. That would just be like just tolls on the sidewalk. That would be.
Why not, Micah? Think bigger.
We've got all these drones, right? That they can capture your faces. Just saying, there's real innovation to be had here in walking charging technology.
Right. Like just imagine cameras just charging people for every step they take on the sidewalk, and every bit of driving they do on the roads. Also, it's a monopoly, right? Like if you live on a piece of property, there's only one sidewalk that's going to be in front of you. There's not going to be multiple sidewalks, right? So there's really basic forms of infrastructure which need some sort of collective ownership model. Now, you could have like ownership by your neighborhood association. Like they have that in Sweden, actually. They have like a lot of ownership by like the cooperative ownership of like roads. It's like private. I know some libertarians talk about this, but it's still not like for-profit business owned. But I think people do overrate how much infrastructure needs. For instance, if you look at the history of this country, we used to have a really elaborate private rail network, and all of it was private. New York's metro, it's private. Japan has the best rail system in the world. It's private. Its metro systems are also private. And Mexico, they have bus rapid transit, which is a huge form of transportation. And in many cities around the world, those bus rapid transportation systems use private buses. So not everything has to be private. There's a lot of arguments that certain forms of infrastructure are actually better private. Let me give you one example. Brightline in Florida is the most successful recent rail project we've seen in this country, and it was done for the cost of under, I believe, $50 billion. Please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I thought it was like 20 or something like that. Meanwhile, California's high-speed rail project is north of $100 billion in cost, and it's been going on for way longer, and it's not even close to being complete. Right. And so you could say private companies maybe have more of an incentive to minimize cost, to not engage in the kind of like stupid contracting, which is like super, needs to make everything green and needs to make everything go to the right form of small businesses and whatever, and so on and so forth. So infrastructure is very important. Some of it needs to be public. All of it needs to be well funded, because even private mass transit needs public support, because it's really expensive. And as STL says, there's positive externalities. And if there's positive externalities, you need subsidies. And if it's extremely, extremely capital intensive, you probably need public capital to be made available for it. Let me give you one more example. The Texas Central High-Speed Rail Project, which is supposed to connect Houston and Dallas, has received all of the approvals from the government. There's eminent domain, it's received its permits, everything, right? But it has not happened. Why? Because billions and billions, probably north of $10 billion of cost, is hard to raise from shareholders, especially for a very long-term project, because most people don't want to send billions of dollars to a company with the idea that they might get paid in 12 years, most of that money back, right? They don't want to do that. And so that's why the government needs to be there to help fix that issue.
Yep, government needs to be involved. That's kind of inherently part of our positions. Again, whether the ownership model and things like that, of course, we can quibble on. Our public transit episode, we talked about that as well. The type of ownership model for public transit, and you could probably hear us talk about that to a bit of a more in-depth degree. But guys, that's not exactly the topic. Let's start with Micah. What kind of infrastructure spending is the best kind, and why do you say it's the best?
Say mass transit is really, really important. I think, of course, there's plenty of metros around this country which have like no riders and receive tons of public money. So clearly, it's not all public spending on mass transit is good. I think for the potential highest ROI spending is on mass transit, because it's a much more efficient way of us moving around. I'd say like developing metros offers a more renewable. I see that Econoboy is just having a discussion in the background.
We should probably keep going so we can hide the audio. So I totally agree with the mass transit point. One of the benefits is that they are often fairly capital intensive. There's also just network effects, right? Like the larger the network is, the more those positive externalities will be. The more places you can go on one network, the easier. So all that amounts to that you probably need more public financing for stuff like mass transit than individual transit, right?
Roads are bad. We don't like
right.
roads so much. Eisenhower destroyed this country with freeways. And here's something that we should say. Unlike some communists around here, I believe that people should have to pay for what they use. That includes roads, except for the roads, like side roads, like freeways. Definitely you should have to pay for that. Look at Singapore. Singapore uses ERP, congestion pricing, and for heavily used roads, and it is fantastic. It raises revenue, it reduces traffic. It's phenomenal. And the biggest problem that we've had in this country is that we don't charge people to use the road. It's fully subsidized, while mass transit or old mass transit systems you had to pay for. And what did that do? People respond to price incentives. They would use the freeway over the paid private rail, and that's why they all got absolutely decimated.
No, I mean there's a really big incentive difference here. And Econoboy, if you need to head out, we can wrap this up really quick.
No, you guys are good. Yeah, sorry, I muted my mic on the stream, but I think you guys must have caught my
still on the
hot
Discord?
mic or something like that. But anyway, no, I should be good. You guys are fine.
Well, so the I think that differential is something. It's one of the undertold stories of U.S. infrastructure is that we enormously financed federal highways. In fact, the government doesn't even take enough taxes to pay for the cost of maintaining those highways. The gas tax pays for, I think it's now about a third, but I could be wrong. I think that's out of date. like a third of the cost we spend for highways, we don't raise nearly enough taxes from drivers to account for the subsidy we provide to it. So of course people shift towards highways. You've made it cheap. There's a lot of reasons to do so, right? Like if cars are cheap and they're easy, and we have subsidized roads in every street, we literally subsidize suburbs through mortgage deductions and stuff, right? There's all these collective reasons we built up that, of course, you're not going to use a mass transit because you live in the suburbs, you drive on subsidized roads, you use subsidized fuel effectively. Like, of course, you'll shift to that. So I don't know. As a radical, I agree with the neoliberal. It would actually be funny to see. I would like to see public-owned transits, not private transits, but same difference. I'm sorry, public-owned tolls, not private tolls on highways. Yeah, make people pay
the
for what they're
problem is
using.
the government's just really bad at doing stuff. And I saw that that Najawan, or whatever this guy is, my number one hater in the replies, is saying the only reason why California's high-speed rail project is so expensive is because of CEQA. Now, CEQA sucks. It should be absolutely destroyed. So should so many elements of our national permitting process be destroyed. For those who don't know, CEQA is something that makes environmental review for California projects even more strenuous than it is nationally under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So it's bad. But the reality is there's so many examples of the government spending money very inefficiently and administering things very inefficiently. And that's because, well, the government actors don't necessarily always have the best incentives. We have tons of examples of public sector contracts where the government gives public employees tons of job protections, gives them non-competitive salaries, unsustainable retirement benefits, because those public sector unions are constituents. They support, they donate to the campaign, they vote, they knock on doors. We've seen this a lot, and sometimes it looks a bit like a quid pro quo. We've also seen contracting, including with the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill, be really ridiculous because we have all these standards that preference certain types of really small businesses, Buy America requirements, like renewable energy requirements have to be renewably provided, right? All these super high labor standards. And what does it do? It just raises the cost a lot. And sometimes it produces absurdities where, for instance, we were supposed to fund all of these these
big
none of them have been built.
You cut out. Repeat. You were talking about chargers, I think.
Right. We were supposed to build all these new, super high standard, amazing, incredible quality EV chargers around the country, and none of them have been built. Why? Because the standards were not reasonable.
Well,
right?
But I don't know. I think that I will say though that I think that we can cleanly kind of talk about this because obviously national regulations are national, right? You know, every state in theory has to deal with a lot of these regulations. And I think that you can compare like renewable energy development in a place like Texas to a place like maybe California, or, maybe, slightly less regulatory burdensome blue states like Illinois, where they don't have this CEQA thing, but, they still have to deal with the same national regulations. The difference in those two states, and you see a huge difference in renewables deployment, is that it's just generally easier to build. Now, you still have the same sort of boosted subsidies for, union wages and things like this that you're talking about, Micah, but way more renewables being built at cheaper costs in Texas than in a state like Illinois or Washington, places like this.
Blanket illegal. A lot of times the government just makes things completely and totally illegal to do. Right.
Well, also much more expensive, right? And so that's what I'm saying is that I think that I was going to say, SDL, real quick. I think that the big problem here is not necessarily things like small business contracting standards or boosted subsidies for. No, it's not. Like in terms of degrees, the big problem is NIMBY regulations preventing land use for productive activities and stuff like that. There's a lot of public infrastructure development in other countries that goes substantially under or on budget, and the big difference is that it's just easier to build things in a lot of those places.
You have to keep in mind.
All I want to say, just for the sake of time, because I know we have about 20 minutes left, we did a whole discussion, maybe not as in depth as it should have been, on SOEs versus private enterprises. I think one of our takeaways was that often they're fairly comparable, but one of Econoboy's insights, I argue, was that often where there's a social benefit the government is trying to pursue, they are less efficient. Where they're run like a business, they seem to be about on par. All I want is Joe Manchin put in charge of the national toll road system, okay? Is that too much to punish him for all the fossil fuel he emitted into the world, that he must run the toll road system on
that
the
is
highways
his purgatory.
like a business?
That's true.
I just think they are very rarely ever run like a business, especially in the United States, because of a ton of political incentives, which are deleterious.
Well, we'll put Joe Manchin up there.
objective.
He's unflappable, clearly. Nothing can persuade that man. Not even
I know,
West
I know,
Virginia
but-
into a utopia.
I know, but I think that, maybe again, we can have another one of these videos. I think I've come up with like, an endless number of examples of the kind of rent seeking that we see with kind of politicians trying to give up all these giveaways to certain constituencies and make things sound better than they are. And doing it basically sabotaging their own spending, being extraordinarily wasteful of what they do. We see this all the time with even demand side subsidies, right? Oh, we're going to do this demand side subsidy here, this demand side subsidy here. Why? It sounds really good. It makes the constituency happy. The realtors like the housing subsidies. Is it good policy? No, it's not. Because, ultimately the government doesn't work in our best interest. It works in the interest of those political actors which make the decisions, which are often very different than what's good for us all.
Uh-oh. Cut out, repeat.
My God, the IT issues.
I'm saying, but we should be funding public infrastructure. It should just, some of it should be private.
Well, so what we were talking about before you came back, Akana Boy, was just toll roads and highways. I don't know. I'm not actually that opposed to it. I think you probably need a gradated roll out of it. But like, especially in a world where like we're not taxing gas, and as we're moving towards electric vehicles, you need some way to tax vehicles. In fact, we're currently subsidizing EVs, right? So, which, in my opinion, is ridiculous. We give in this country $125 billion a year to highways, is my understanding, and about like $1.2 billion to rails and other mass transit. The spending in this country is, in fact, ridiculous relative to where we'd expect the most social benefit to occur. I want to see mega cities. I want to see mass transit projects. I want to see both ecologically and budget efficient. One of the things that's under discussed as well, spreading people out makes the economy less efficient and makes city budgets less efficient. It's incredible. People who live in density on the order of New York City, they cost about 1/5 as much per person to get public services like schools, pipes, all the other crap to their house than people out in the sticks. Even relative to suburbs, it's about a 2 to 3 times difference. So yes, I want to cram everyone to the cities. That I think should be an explicit policy goal.
SDL believes in the big cube.
That's right.
That is his policy.
Both because it is more efficient for city budgets, but two, it's economically efficient. There is a ton of evidence that simply being able to talk to other people, walk to other people, living in dense spaces is economically beneficial because it has scale effects. So yeah, let's maximize scale effects, bomb the suburbs back into the cities.
Big cube. Yeah, I think overall,
Prophecy does not endorse this.
I mean, I am an urbanist myself. I really think what you need to do is just restore choice. I think that people reflect their preferences whenever they're given a real marketplace to do so. And I think the government, this is an example of the government thinking it knows what's best for everybody and it going really awry. Back right after the World War II period, we decided that it was the age of the car. The government took deliberate action to orient our entire society around automobiles. They dug up trains and trolley cars because they said this is our time. They put in place regulations to make everything car-centric, like parking requirements, density limits, and the like. They said they knew what's best for us, and they were wrong. And if they would have just let us reveal our own preferences with choices and market-based mechanisms, well, then we would have a much better orientation of our urban spaces today. I don't think that the solution to that is the government to go balls to the wall, like let's go to war against cars. I think it's just restore choice, and eventually I think we're going to lead to where I want us to go. But I think there is a certain epistemic humbleness that I like to have, which I think people that are more in favor of using state power don't have, which is that I have policy views, but ultimately I think that we need to have a very high degree of confidence before the government backs something, because ultimately the government is an entity of force. Everything it does is coercive. It takes people's stuff, it gives it to other people. It makes laws. It says you can't do this thing you wanted to do, you can't do this, or you have to do this thing which you didn't want to do, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we're like anarchists and we're going to say the government shouldn't do anything. It just means that before we use force against each other, we should be really sure that we have a good reason to do so. And we should also be really sure that this policy is actually going to achieve what we want it to achieve.
I will just say, on the war on cars, I will hold my peace. I will not say anything. But if I speak, but more broadly, I do broadly agree. I do just think, again, one of the understated positive externalities I think of, like you've mentioned, that yes, there's many private systems which have fairly efficient mass transit systems. But if we think that there's positive externalities to this, we want even more than the private market would occur. Like, in other words, if we think there are super normal, like positive returns to scale from people living in cities, which I do, I think there's pretty strong reason to believe it. Then I think that you really do want to densify people, like as like even more than their preferences might indicate, by subsidizing those decisions. That's all.
I'm not sure you'd have to talk about what it would look like if we actually had no distortionary backing of automobiles,
Sure.
and like people were really given choice, and whether the output of urbanism, like the urban environment it would give us, would be really substantially different from like what we'd say the optimal one is, and whether we could actually appraise positive externalities. Because it looks like right now
It's
the government is basically like doubling down on something with negative externalities.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it's like once you remove the doubling down on negative externalities, there's like some extra positive externality which is left over.
Yeah, SCL, it seemed like you wanted to say something. I guess I can jump in. Yeah, I think that overall, I would say that my answer to the fundamental question of the audience, what is the best type of infrastructure spending? The way that I like to think about it is like, what's the kind of infrastructure spending that you could spend too much on in general, right? And there's certain kinds of infrastructure where it's like, man, it just seems like if the government quintupled down on the amount of spending they did, it just seems like we'd get better results, right? So, and it does depend on the country. Like, some of the things that Micah mentioned, I see maps like this all the time where it's like amount of investment in public high-speed rail, and it's like by country, and you see this crazy rail infrastructure that China has versus America. Now in China, they've arguably overinvested, right? Because you see news stories where it's like China spends 10 billion equivalent USD on this new rail line, and literally nobody uses it, right? Even though it's really nice and fancy or whatever, right? So they've probably gone a little bit overboard. But in the US, as an example, we could probably stand to spend significantly more on our rail infrastructure than we do now.
10 times, it wouldn't be an issue.
I mean, actually true, unironically. Now, I think that this is all in the context, ideally in hopefully a more YIMBYist type regulatory environment where public dollars can actually be executed efficiently. That's something that's worth talking about as well. Like if I was in California, I don't know if I'd support a lot of public spending on infrastructure. We talked about this very early on in our housing episode with just Micah and I, where like if I lived in San Francisco, I literally don't think I would support putting money into public housing because it's so ridiculously hard to build anything in San Francisco. It's like, what are we even paying for? We're spending $1 million to build one public toilet. That's a real thing that happened in San Francisco. It's literally unbelievable how expensive it is to build anything in San Francisco because of all the regulatory burden. The absolute primary thing is regulatory burden when it comes to building things, especially things like cross-state line infrastructure projects that can get just ridiculously complicated on the infrastructure. One of the reasons why, in Texas, there's been talk for decades about a high-speed rail line between Houston and Dallas. It's very complicated, even intrastate, to go across county lines and across multiple cities to connect two cities by way of a high-speed rail line, even though in theory it's something that a lot of people would really love and really take advantage of. I mean, I don't know who would want to actually go to Dallas personally, but presumably there are some people that would want to go to Dallas. But people have been talking about it for a long time. And so, that's something worth really thinking about as well. But I think
I agree.
We want to build it so they can escape over here and then go back whenever they're eventually.
That's true. A one-way rail line, one-way tickets only, just, for functional purposes.
I agree. The most efficient way to spend the $100 billion federal infrastructure budget would be lobbying every state to adopt a uniform zoning code with no community input.
I think it's important to recognize something else that I did not mention previously, which plays into what I've been saying on this podcast for a long time, and I'm going to say with increasing sophistication. Okay, as I repeat, I'll get better at saying it, which is that politicians respond to political incentives, and politicians make up the government, and those political incentives often include lobbyists. which leads politicians, and changing political coalitions to abandon projects prematurely. We've seen this all over the place. Look at the UK, HS2. What happened to that? What happened to HS2? That's Texas Central project you just mentioned. Republicans are against it now. Why? The political coalitions have shifted, and so the long term, there is not. Public projects have this issue with long term political resolve that private projects may not have issue with, and if you can give public capital to reliable public capital to those projects, long-term credit, you can maybe get the best of both worlds. And there's also community review. Okay. We hate it. It's disgusting. It's terrible. It's all over the place. Everything the government does, people are able to go to community meetings about it. And I think it's the product of a political incentive in that politicians want to get credit for the stuff they do. And they want to make sure that the constituents that actually are paying attention are happy with it. And so they want to include them as much as possible. And it just so happens to be the case that those constituents have stupid ideas. And this process makes it take way longer than it should. It's bad, but it might be politically beneficial.
It would be extremely funny. Okay, I just want to pose a hypothetical. So we're 5 years down the line. Yimbism, the woke mind virus, has taken over the American people, right? So now at your community review meetings, nobody shows up to oppose the project. It's just a cheerleading session, right? You're like, I want to build a high-speed rail line. This is where I'm building it. And 10 girls just come out right there. They got their pom-poms out. They're like, yes, please, sir. The Boy Scouts come out. They're saluting you.
I'd love it. I would love it personally. I want those community input meetings to be like when Kim Jong-un goes to a campaign rally in North Korea. Okay, how many
on the gates, please give us.
How many of you approve of this project? It's 99.99%, one undecided. Okay, that's the kind of vote that I want on our public infrastructure projects. But anyway, but that's kind of my thought. I think that in terms of what infrastructure spending is best, it's pretty easy to identify in most countries what type of infrastructure is really underinvested in. In America, for instance, rail infrastructure, like I mentioned, is probably one of those things. You could argue that highway infrastructure might be underinvested in from a maintenance perspective. You might say our ports and bridges need more investment to be to be expanded and maintained. Things like this. In terms of what infrastructure America overinvests in, it's hard to say because I think our infrastructure is typically graded pretty poorly. So I'm not sure what we might claw back money from.
Well, I think in states like Texas, we definitely overinvest in freeways because we're always freaking expanding them. We keep elevating them, making them wider. I mean, it's absolutely
when I say underinvest in highways, I mean insofar as we have highways that people are driving on, they shouldn't be falling apart. Right, they should be well paved and maintained. And if they're not going to be well paved and maintained, might as well just knock them down and say we're not driving here anymore. Versus having the shitty fucking carpet bombed looking highways that we have in some areas of this country.
I do want to offer the urbanist perspective for the privatized toll roads. If you do ever want to end the highways, it will actually, you're right, Micah, be a big political problem if the politicians have to kill it. But if you privatize it, and then eventually cars become so rare and expensive, well, then you don't have to kill the highway. They'll just shut it down.
Well, it's because whenever people have to pay the cost of driving a car, and that includes the external cost of carbon taxation for the emissions they cause, maybe some other tax because of the particulate matter effects, it's really expensive. It's really expensive. People a lot of the inefficient decisions that people make in this country are not because of they're consumers are not rational enough. They're just really stupid, right? No, it's because we have all these things largely distorted by government intervention, all these crazy subsidies, in large part that are in place because of special interest group capture and really bad decisions by bureaucrats.
I admire your support for historical materialism and the importance of materialism for people's politics. I do unfortunately think there is a sort of cultural hysteresis, cultural lock-in, where cars are part of people's lifestyles, living in suburbans, it's part of being a masculine man that you have a picket fence. I am worried about sort of cultural lock-in. That's part of the reason I'm willing to say there is in fact a necessity of public funding of sort of urbanization. You actually want to counteract those cultural effects as much as you can.
I think that I don't know how locked in they are because when people move to a place like DC where it's really inconvenient to use a car, it's pretty inconvenient. You don't have to pay that much for it, but it's really inconvenient. And the mass transit's there. Now they want to use it. right?
People definitely do switch, and there's been some really interesting studies even on the rollout of Uber on reducing car ownership. So like when you provide alternatives to car ownership, people do reduce it, but it's in particular, it's only say like a 50% reduction. It's not like a complete replacement. That's what you'd expect if cars still have some utility, sure. But it's also just that I think the people who are willing to move to a city may be different than those who are stuck out in the suburbs, right? Like there's actually a literal political difference there that overwhelmingly people in the cities will be voting Dem and probably do not have the same machismo idea of like car, suburb, picket fence, strong guy, strong car.
The last thing I'll say on this, and then Cameron, you can say whatever you want, is that there are some people that love cars. They want to drive everywhere. They love their sprawl. They love not being able to walk anywhere. They love the drive-throughs. They're disgusting to me. I'm not sure if they're human beings. They might be Russian spies or like some sort of psyop operation, but they exist. And this is a freaking free country. You see that flag in Econoboy's background? That's the American flag. This is a free country. This is a country where people make their own choices and they have their own preferences that we respect. Okay? And so I will not have their rights trampled on.
Yeah, their right to drive on the toll roads between the cubes, right? Between Cube City A and Cube City 7.
Yeah.
Oh god.
But I think overall that's kind of at least that's my answer overall to sum up is there's going to be types of infrastructure that are highly underinvested, and I think that one thing that we weren't able to talk about as much is that's also probably going to be greatly different if you're a developing versus more developed, sort of already wealthy nation, right? When it comes to the type of infrastructure spending that you're spending too much on, the answer is doubly so not the case that you're spending too much on it if you're a developing country. Because a lot of developing countries, there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit, right? Building a bunch of public schools and a bunch of hospitals and, a bunch of road infrastructure and, whatever it might be that you need, water infrastructure, utility infrastructure, all these kind of things that you simply just don't have because you're a developing country that is coming from a place with less sort of capital development in general. Somebody mentioned sewage infrastructure, stuff like that as well. So that when you're a developing country, your options for where to funnel money are much wider because you probably just have substantially less sort of embodied infrastructure development than we're talking about from the perspective of a wealthy nation. But from the perspective of a wealthy nation, there are probably a lot of things that you're still underinvesting in relative to what people might prefer in their infrastructure, right? So what do you guys have with regards to closing thoughts, and then we can wrap it on up?
Bring the private trains back. I want a bright line train everywhere. I want to be like Japan, okay? Competing private subway lines, because there's so many that they're just like two. Which one do I choose today, huh? Which one has the lower fares? Okay, private BRT, okay? All over the place. Public stops, private BRT. Everyone pays the price of their own transportation system. Beautiful.
I'm disgusted personally by that. STL, final thoughts.
I'm joining the war on cars on the side of the cube cities. It's as simple as that, okay?
Listen, we will create a platform organization to destroy car infrastructure, but then we will go our separate ways, gentlemen. That is what I'm hearing personally. That was our infrastructure topic. Thanks to the Patreons for voting for it. That's kind of our thoughts. It sounds like we all like trains a lot. Whether or not those trains are privately owned, though, another topic for a different day. Again, if you want a more in-depth explanation on that, should public transit be free was a topic that we discussed, and we actually discussed this in greater detail in that clip from one of our episodes. But thanks for suggesting the topic. It was a good one. Well, guys, that was our show for the week. We had a fun time speaking with all of you once again. In the next couple weeks, we will come back with not only another couple of topics that we'll be talking about, not only probably some election updates like we've been doing, but also with the round of 32, when our policies get whittled down to half of what they are today, who will win out, socialist, liberal, or social democratic policies? Vote on our Twitter, the 3 Wonks. It's our pinned tweet. Make your voices heard. SDL.
I'm predicting a social democratic sweep, but I did have to read one thing from chat. Voer says, I was late to mandatory college because the transit workers are striking, and it's the only way I can get to my job at the dog breeding factory socialized after cars were banned, and I'm forced to live in the Cube City. This is, in fact, the Wonk ideal world.
This is, in fact, the Wonk ideal.
SDL ideal world, okay? I want
They haven't accepted it yet, but the Wonk world will be coming to Cube City.
Listen, in the war between car-centric infrastructure and mass transit, I know which side I'm on, and I know which side America should be on.
Listen, Micah, all Yimbys are in favor of the cube, okay? Some Yimbys just don't have the courage to say that they are, but we all support
I want
the cube.
I want the cube to be privately owned. So long as it's privately owned, I have no problem.
Yeah. But all right, guys. Hey, thanks for watching. Shout out to some of our Patreons. Let me pull up the list here. $10 Patreon members. These guys are certainly disproportionately responsible for supporting this show. William, Fieni, Theas, Friedrich, Elias Jackson, Copy. Thanks a ton for supporting the show. Again, patreon.com/the3wonks. It helps a ton. We also have full YouTube monetization now, which is pretty cool. So I guess, watch our ads and, I don't know, have fun with that, I guess. And that should be fun as well. Thanks for coming out. We'll be, back online in the next couple weeks. And again, be sure to vote on all of our Twitter polls to decide which policies make it to the second round. Really quick, gentlemen, before we end the show, I forgot to ask on the tournament, what do you think the final four will be? And who do you think the winner policy will be right before we hang up? So my final four, I've got single payer versus sectoral bargaining, a couple of my policies in the final four on the left side of the bracket. And I've got $80 carbon tax and dividend and LVT being the final, two on the right side of the bracket. In terms of the finale, I think carbon tax and dividend beats LVT. Okay, that is an underdog pick. I'm not necessarily as confident in that pick, but I think the finale will be single payer versus carbon tax. I think the winner will be carbon tax. What do you guys think? Who are the final four be? Who will be the winner of this bracket?
So I think if my multi-payer wins, which it's really neck and neck right now, I think that could be the winner, because you've seen in your brackets in the past, multi-payer just manages to win.
There's typically a healthcare system reform that makes it to the final four. That's why I say, Swiss versus single payer.
Medicine has no chance. I think that one's like toasted. Like I don't think it makes it. But I think Japanese style zoning or land value tax is a finalist.
That's going to be a powerful matchup. SDL, go for it.
100% land value tax is the pick to make it all the way. Just for an idea, land value tax is currently at 87% in its poll. Okay, 87%.
Based.
That's because it's going against Pigovian tax on food. That's a bit of a weak, matchup. Next round, when it's
a stronger policy, it'll only shine the brighter for it. Iron sharpens iron, Mr. Econoboy.
That's true. A tune-up matchup for LVT in this first round.
But guys, there's DC and PR statehood. Like, those are not abolished the electoral college. Like, this shit it's popular.
I'd be surprised if making DC and Puerto Rico states beats like single payer healthcare in a vacuum. I mean, it could happen, Micah. That's the thing. This is up to the people.
I don't think it beats it in a vacuum. I think it can
go surprisingly far.
Immunity. I feel like people are going to feel bad voting against unqualified immunity.
Look,
I actually think it's fine when cops kill people.
My dark horse for this tournament, I've got one 4-day work week. I think could go surprisingly far. Okay, that was one that I was glad that I thought up.
Everybody's so cringe.
4-day work week could go surprisingly far. It is going to end up beating solidarity strikes, I think, unfortunately, SDL, but it's also a banger of a policy. Okay, I'm looking forward to seeing where 4-day work week goes.
To see all of these social democratic policies that I'm just so owned by publicly funded elections, and
you are get owned. SDL.
And sectoral bargaining. I'm so sad to see them thrive.
Yeah. But all right, that's interesting. So yeah, I think that the winner of this bracket is going to be carbon tax. It could end up being 1% GDP investment in green energy technologies. That could be my dark horse as well. I just think that with all the neo-libs voting, I think that the carbon tax will end up beating the 1% GDP investment. Plus, you add in the dividend. I don't know. It's a pretty attractive policy. But anyway, guys, that's all that we have for this week. All right, tune in the next couple weeks, Micah.
We should make a video at some point, just about like called like is big government bad or something like that. So because we could just debate it, because I think that the most notable difference on this podcast is that I think both you and STL, but mostly STL, you're the most this way, have this view of the state that it's like, yeah, it's pretty good, like it's pretty great, you know.
I think the government's good.
Like, I don't really like it.
I mean, I generally take the view that I think that well-managed SOEs seem to perform about on par with private enterprises. And
really quick, STL,
I know that is the caveat, right? How do you? And I think that's about institutional design.
You're to be clear, STL, that's not your view. That's the view of the literature that Micah sent to us. Okay, we're just taking the evidentiary view on state-owned enterprises.
Yeah. You know, let's just look through.
Ooh,
all the
he's mad. He's mad.
Which never say, which almost I don't think ever say. Even the Norwegian study doesn't say that SOEs are better. They say they're worse. They perform worse, or sometimes,
Micah.
if you get really excited about this, they perform non-statistically differently.
Don't do this, Micah.
Oh my God! Wow,
Micah, your own study doesn't say that. The meta-analysis you sent us.
Wow, like wow, your
Listen,
own system isn't.
For those listening, go to our collective ownership episode on the state-owned enterprise section. Micah got, respectfully bodied in that discussion with regards to his own study. I think we did pretty well picking apart that study. It was a meta-analysis, to be fair. And again, to be fair, the authors came to moderate conclusions. Micah looks at this study where the authors are like, SOEs are better in some circumstances, they're worse in others, it depends on this, and this. And then Micah takes that and he's like, SOEs, can't trust them. Like, this very absolute.
What I said is that I've never read a meta-analysis which says that SOEs are better. And the vast majority of studies that I've read on privatization and on meta-analyses that I've read on privatization and on SOEs versus private businesses says that SOEs are predominantly worse.
I did just want to say that the majority of big government as determined by spending is just stuff like social spending. And the really interesting thing there is when you just at like a first principles, you estimate whether there's a correlation between more social spending and like decline in economic growth, which is what you'd predict. Like it's doing all these taxes that have dead weight loss. It's doing all these taxes that are funding things that are economically unproductive, not aligned with profit incentives, whatever. The correlation is nil. Like it's statistically nil. And in fact, you'd expect it to be negative because social spending goes up during recessions. So I think that often it's a really difficult question, and you have to get into like causal analyses of specific studies without looking at big government.
Look, in our next episode, I want it to be about philosophy. So we'll probably get into some of our foundational first principles in our next episode. Guys, be on the lookout for that. We don't want to get too sidetracked here. We've already bodied Mike on SOEs once, STL. It'd be unfair to do it a second time, especially in this public audience watching. Any last words before?
You're about to get so owned. You're about to get so owned because the research just isn't on your side,
Look, how about this? How about we talked about doing a Micah STL debate on basically liberalism versus socialism.
Oh yeah, why don't y'all watch the first one of those? That was a good debate.
The debate STL doesn't want you to see, some might say.
That we never had a second one of, despite me requesting. Okay,
running away from the second debate.
I'm still not sure about the fundamentals of the economics of cooperatives, right? So that's on me, I suppose. But
you can define your system as much as you want. Anyway,
still can't even define what socialism would look like in order to defend it. Interesting.
I did define it. I gave a list.
Socialist can't defend socialism. God. Wow.
All right.
Look, I'll dish you out the same list I dished out before, okay? But great episode. I think we might be going over Caught Boys and Limits. So
for sure. See you guys.